Hello everyone, this is People Power Remakes the World. My name is Roger Hallam. I design revolutionary change. I was thinking of saying I design campaigns, but I'm going to be a little bit more honest. I create revolutionary change, or at least I design it. So I haven't done a video for a while. As some of you may know, I was in prison in the UK for 14 months. I got out in August. I'm doing this in December 2025. Yes, I did a Zoom call calling for people to engage in civil disobedience. You can find out about it in other places. I'm not going to be talking about prison on this video particularly. Since then, I have been extremely busy trying to work out things that I'm going to talk about in this video. So I'm going to do a few bits of introduction just to set the scene, and then I'll tell you what else is going to be going on in this video. So broadly speaking, there's been a change, arguably a big change, in how activists and campaigners and revolutionaries, or whatever you want to call us, have been thinking about bringing about social change. And there's quite a lot to go through. So it's not really for the faint-hearted. Obviously, you don't need to watch it in one go. You don't even have to watch it at all. There's no pressure, obviously. And I'm really going for a quality audience in the sense of people that are already committed to the various processes that are going to remake the world, hopefully over the next 10 years. And I think I've referred to this before, but there's this Jewish sort of myth, story, mysticism idea that the world gets changed by 7 people. I suppose this relates to the general observation that very few people decide to do what it takes to set up the processes that then change the world, which isn't making any judgment on people who don't or people who do. It's just an observation of how things work. And it's those sort of people I'm going to talk to. And if you're watching this video and going, well, that's not me, that's fine. You can still watch it. It's no problem. If lots of people want to watch it, that's fine by me. But I am going to be focusing on details, as you might say. So, yeah, you hopefully are going to take notes, those of you who are interested. There's going to be a bunch of pathways, the videos and a Zoom call and all this sort of stuff in the description. I'm going to try and make it international, or at least focused upon the potential in Western democracies rather than just about the UK. But a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is in the UK, but the idea is it's broadly transferable to other Western countries, as has happened before over the last 10 years, because broadly everyone's in the same boat and broadly thinks the same. I'm also hoping that, as well as explaining what's going on and what could happen, I'm also going to be giving a few arguments that you can use, or talking points, and there's going to be hopefully a few graphics with 1 or 2 little diagrams and little checklists and talking point type stuff, so that might help you. So there's 2 things I'm going to do then. One is the broad situation, right, the strategic landscape, and then I'm going to home in on certain dynamics of mobilisation, how you get people on the go. And I'm going to spend quite a lot of time on that and look at some of the maths, dare I say, the numbers. So I'm going to assume that most people watching this are broadly aware of various theories and backgrounds. If there's various things that you don't understand, you can always look at my 50 episodes of Designing the Revolution if you want to know some of the background to it. And there's 1 or 2 buxom things I'll come on to that I've written. So as far as I'm concerned, it's all going to be a relaxed format. I'm not going to try and be overly impressive. I might go around in circles, apologies for that, but hopefully I'll do my best, and we're just going to stride through it and see where we get up to. And just to emphasise again, if you don't like it, fine, just don't watch it. That's all good with me. I think over the last 2 or 3 years, there's different ways of describing this, but over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a sort of shift in how we're seeing what's happening in the world. So for the sake of argument, maybe there's 3 things. The first thing is obviously the far right. We've got Trump in America, We've got the far-right parties in Germany, in France, in the UK, who look like, at the moment, they may well win the next elections in those countries. We've got the far-right in power in Italy, and various other details. So we've got this big surge of the far-right. Calling it the far-right, maybe it's fascist, maybe it isn't. We can argue about the words. But we all know broadly what that means and broadly what might happen if the far-right is in control as and when various ruptures happen. Which brings us on to the second issue, is that the whole existential threat scenario is booming away and becoming more exponential. We've got obviously the climate going over 1.5. I've talked about this in loads of other places. We've got this emergent notion of AI, people losing their jobs and such like. And we've got the general bankruptcy of Western democracies, the state, due to having to pay loads of debt, and there's lots of things about that. So I'm not going to talk about these things in detail. This is a video for people that already know it sucks and the issue is what's going to happen about it. But it's good to sort of lay out the landscape to a certain extent in a talk like this. So the upshot of it is what I'm going to be talking about here could not be more important. That doesn't mean I'm a great person or anything. I'm just saying, as far as I'm concerned, these dynamics, strategies, tactics, orientations are going to make the world into a far better place. Or if they're not enacted, then we're going to go down to this spiral of fascistic collapse. And that's why you're watching it, right? So that doesn't mean that I'm a great person. It doesn't mean this is not about me. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. I'm in various teams. I talk to lots of people around the Western world. So obviously there's a big combination of collective intelligence going on. All right. So in so much as there might be a few new people watching this and you're thinking, who's this weird guy, Roger Hallam, I'm going to say one or two things that make me sound reasonably impressive. I think the New Statesman, I think I'm the 34th most influential progressive person in the UK, for what it's worth. I had a profile of me in The Economist last week. I think they were making out that civil disputes around the Western world was due to me, or at least in Brixton, which obviously isn't true. But, they were saying I'm a cool guy. And I'm a co-founder of Extinction Rebellion and various other of the big climate campaigns around the Western world. And I do lots of behind the scenes type stuff to advise and strategically influence, I suppose, different direct action movements and increasingly community-based mobilisations and electoral campaigns. I'll come to that in a minute. So I'm not saying all this because, again, I'm being big-headed about it. I'm just saying I've done a few things and hopefully you'll give me 3 hours of your time. So I'm going to say a little bit about the title. So People Power Remakes the World. So there's two things going on about that. I quite like the word people power because it's not non-violent resistance. So it's basically about people and the power that people have when they come together. So that sounds pretty good to me. Remake the world. I'm trying to imply we're not going to spend all our time talking about the negativity, how terrible the bad guys are, how we've got to resist them. We need to be loads more ambitious and positive than that. We can say, all the shit that's coming down the road is enabling the potentiality to remake the world, to make something new, exciting, that hasn't happened in human history before, because if we don't, we're potentially going extinct and all the rest of it. I'm going to talk more about the shift in strategy that I've just touched upon. Then I'm going to talk about the theoretical basis of the propositions and work that I've done along with other people. Then really we're going to get onto the heart of the situation, which is the mobilisation dynamics and the numbers and the ratios and all this sort of stuff. Then that's going to, in some ways, going to be the main part of the video. But it's really important that we don't neglect organisational training, culture sort of aspects. So I'm going to talk about that towards the end. And then I'm going to look at the end game, how you take control of the state, and a sort of update on how that could or should happen. All right, so the shift in the big strategy. So this isn't in my notes, but maybe I need to say this now, that watch lots of videos and listen to lots of podcasts or talk to campaigners, organisers, revolutionaries, whatever. and they'll tell you, oh, we're doing this, this little thing, it's great, it's needed. There's no strategic sort of awareness or analysis. We're doing this little campaign, or we're standing in this election, or we're doing this mutual aid project. And there's this sort of implicit assumption that someone else, somewhere else, is actually organising how you actually build a revolution or build the taking of the state, all these interrelated ideas of systemic change. And then maybe there's the implication that this is just going to spontaneously arise, right? All these groups are going to do something, and suddenly, in some sort of vaguely religious, mystical way, they're all going to come together. So my main proposition before I start is maybe you're right, maybe these people are right, but probably not. Strategy has to be thought about if it's going to actually happen. It needs to be planned. And also, we need to have a plan for the whole system. What I mean by that is how you mobilise in your locality, how that builds up, and how then you take control of the state. This is partially because that's what's necessary at the present historical moment, and it's also that's what's going to inspire people, because if you're going to have mass mobilisation, you can't do it around little itsy bitsy projects because there's no credibility to them, with all due respect. It's not that little projects aren't necessary. Obviously, lots of little projects have to happen because that's where you're starting off. But there has to be a plan for how those little projects synergize and cooperate together and then build into a mass movement that then takes state power and transforms society and all the rest of it. So someone has to actually create that process, and that's what this video is about, and that's what the project I'm involved in, which doesn't mean we exactly know what it's going to be like. That's another matter. Obviously we don't, but you build the plan so the plan doesn't happen, but the plan enables you to get to the position where the plan doesn't happen, and then you iterate on it. That's the general process. One thing is there's a general exhaustion around the existential threat issue. In other words, with the whole climate movement, there's a sense in which you can't be thinking about existential threat all the time because it's exhausting, it gets repeated, it gets boring, people switch off. So that's one dynamic. And the second dynamic is it gets so bad that paradoxically, people don't even want to think about it. And so you get this short-termism. Even in the liberal space, people will talk about the technical sides of the climate crisis, but they won't actually talk about the existential side because it's just so bad. And of course, on the right and the far right, there's just no intention to talk about it at all because there's this hyper short-termism, which is party now, die later sort of dynamic. So obviously, both of these avoidance techniques, the extreme far right one and the liberal, more sort of subtle but still sort of fucked one, isn't going to last by definition because we're looking at a physical situation. So these ruptures are going to come. But at the present historical moment, 2025 and maybe in 2026, there's this exhaustion feeling and there's this avoidance repression situation. And as we've just mentioned, there's this increase in the far right, partially because reality is too difficult to look at. And so people move towards this sort of irrational nationalism, anti-immigration sort of stuff, which is no solution at all, as no doubt everyone will find out in due course. So on the positive side about what to think about it, the shift in the big strategy is towards the local and the social. So the local, in so much as going to the people, means getting involved in a locality and then building up a mobilisation in that locality. And it's related to the social because local people in their own situation are primarily concerned with what might be called bread and butter issues: housing, food, security, cost of living. And then the idea is to build a coalition through these social moves, these social campaigns rooted in local areas. Historically, often you have a revolutionary period and the revolution gets hit on the head, and all the revolutionaries either shot or go to prison or, pushed into the out of the social space. And what they decide to do is go to the people, as it's called, classically called. So there's a long tradition of this. It's happened in Russia in the 19th century. You can see it sort of in solidarity, or read a few books on this in prison about it. You kept getting knocked down by the Communist Party, and then you start developing these network connections within the social space. In Chile, after 1974, lots of people went into the poor areas, developed cooperatives because you couldn't do anything political because, bad things would happen to you. So in Britain, for instance, people have been, gone to prison like myself, come out of prison. I can't do civil disobedience. I'll go back to prison for 2 or 3 years or whatever it will be. So then people are moving into the community as a general sort of strategic shift. All right, so that then raises a tension. And again, I mentioned this before, I think in communist theory, or at least with the Bolsheviks, between 1900 and 1917, there was this debate around propaganda and agitation. And the propaganda was this purist approach. You get people to talk about Marx on Thursday night, and then you've got the agitation approach, which is meeting people where they are, so getting a pay rise for the workers. And the risks of both. Obviously, the propaganda thing is problematic because no one wants to talk about Marx on Thursday night, as everyone sort of knows. But the problem with going to the workers where they're at is you degenerate into some sort of reformism, and you're not looking at the structural issues. So the point here is not that one's right and one's wrong necessarily. The point is there's a problem, right? And the problem requires a nuanced approach of balance, and then a sort of iteration, and trying to move people around to something that combines the best of both approaches. So that, in other words, the devil's in the detail. That's what we're going to talk about, this local social shift into social issues, into local mobilisation, going on the estates, as you might say. But the theory is very important in the sense that this enables you to do good design. If you're not thinking about theory, then by default you think about neoliberal theory. In other words, if you're not interrogating your assumptions, then you end up doing bad design because you're just saturated in neoliberal ways of thinking, which we'll come on and discuss a little bit. So while I was in prison, I wasn't reading Adorno himself because that's too complicated, but I was reading books about him. So Adorno is this guy in the mid-20th century, and he has lots to say about why the left generally is not doing the business. There's lots to be said about this, but one of the meta-theoretical ideas is that whatever system you create, if you think it's the totality, then number one, you're wrong, because there's no such thing as a totality. In other words, if you create a system, there's always stuff outside the system that doesn't belong there and escapes from it, fragments or surplus, as it's called. And you need to be aware of that if you're going to be smart in basically doing social design. So it's not like, this is Roger Hallam's system, take it or leave it, it's the objective truth, or any of that nonsense. There's always new things coming in, there's always things that escape. And of course, this is why you have to do iterative thinking. You do something, by definition, it's not going to be complete, and then you iterate, taking account of these elements you hadn't thought of. And the second thing, of course, referring to the mid-20th century, is if you think you've got a totality, then it's tempting to be quite unpleasant to other people because you think you're right, and if you think you're objectively right, then obviously other people are objectively wrong, and then you can do them in and put them in prison and shoot them, or whatever happens historically. There's a few sort of key points to be made here, right? The first one is the system, like social reality, is dynamic. It's always changing, which relates to this totality idea. But it's not that it's always changing, that's one thing, but it changes in non-linear ways. So this is like the central challenge of thinking clearly about how we're going to bring about social change, because the sort of neoliberal culture that we're in, which goes very deep, by the way, deeper than neoliberalism potentially, is that things just go along in a linear way. You're doing your campaign, you do this, and then you do this, and you get a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. And that's ingrained in us, but it's rubbish, right? Usually what happens is nothing changes, in the sense you're doing this, and you do this, and you do this, and you haven't got anywhere. So everyone sort of knows what that's like. You've got a mutual aid project and it's got 20 people involved and it does A, B and C, and a year later it's got 22 people involved and nothing really happens. And a lot of the defeatism on the left is related to this phenomenon because it makes the error of thinking, therefore nothing can happen, because it's so difficult, as everyone knows, to actually make change happen because there's so many barriers. However, that's not the whole system. There's a surplus, there's something else going on, which is non-linearity. So what non-linearity means, or non-linear dynamics, is that at a certain point, suddenly you get a positive feedback loop. In other words, those 22 people lead to 26, and the 26 lead to 32, and the 32 lead to 120, leads to 2,000, and 2,000 leads to 200,000, and suddenly you get, right? And this happens a lot as well as nothing happening. So the linear thing is actually quite unusual, where you're just going up in a gradual way. Usually what happens is nothing really happens for ages, and then something happens, and then it goes boom. And of course, what this video is about, and all the work that I do and other people would do, is how to proactively design non-linearity. So in other words, instead of just waiting, for some arbitrary combination of factors to make things go off, you actually go, okay, so how can we create a positive feedback loop in the system? So I haven't got this down here, but an obvious example is the Green Party. The Green Party has been going since 1974, 1976, I think it started as the Ecology Party in the UK anyway. And then it became the Green Party. When I was a teenager, it was there. And for the whole of my life, the Green Party has been going, maybe every now and again 6% on the polls. And then Zach Palensky comes along and he does A, B and C. And suddenly, you're on 16, 17%. And maybe, as we'll talk later on in this video, if it goes up to 24%, then there might be a Green government in 3 years' time. Never say never, because of non-linear dynamics in the system. So just to summarise then, there's two mistakes, right? There's the mistake that you think you're doing a project and it's not actually getting anywhere, so you give up. That's a problem. No, you need to keep going at it to just get these little positive feedback loops going on. The other error is not to expect things to go boom and you're going, oh my God, how did that happen? Well, obviously because of nonlinear dynamics. So you make these two errors, and we need to be aware of this. So one of the problems with nonlinear dynamics is most people just can't get their head around it, and then they don't talk about it. So a little example of this is a woman called Ash, I've forgotten her surname anyway, the Navarra woman. She interviewed me about 3 weeks ago. You can see the video. And she was asking me about, the grasping the enormity of the moment. There's two chapters in that book. The second chapter is on nonlinear dynamics, right? But she never used that word, and she never asked me about it, because most people on the left, no disrespect to them, think in a very solid A causes B. They're not thinking about the subtlety of design that enables nonlinearity to take off. All right. So that's what we're going to look at. And this is why lots of people aren't going to watch this video, right? Because they don't like nonlinear dynamics, they're not interested in it. But of course, a minority are, because they know that that's the driver of revolutionary change. And that's what we need at the present moment, as we'll come on to discuss. So this is related to the notion of investment and returns, which has a bit of a bad press, obviously, on the left, because people associate this with capitalism. But obviously it is, in the sense that capitalism, it turbocharges this sort of orientation. I do this and I'm going to make that profit, I reinvest the profit and make more profit, this sort of classical capitalist orientation. But a lot of anti-capitalists sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, reject the whole notion of thinking about doing something and then getting a return. In other words, that leads to more of something. But that's intrinsic to the human condition, right? Every culture, people in that culture, to a certain extent, are involved in techne, I think is the Greek word for it. This form of knowledge where you're going, okay, so here's a table. If I do that, I'm going to get straight edges. If I do something else, I'm not going to get straight edges. In other words, you're instrumentalizing reality because you're trying to make a table. In so much as having tables is a good idea and having a material life is a good idea, obviously that's important. And so this has a central place in how we proactively design what we're going to do. And there's an intrinsic tension here, and I've talked about this lots, and this leads to what myself and other designers call ratios. So what we're doing is we're mining the social space to try and find ratios, or what might be called golden cards. So these are things where we go, oh, if we do this, then double the number of people turn up to the meeting. If we say this in a telephone call, then double the number of people will give a monthly donation. If we do this when we're asking for petitions, then 50 people will sign an hour rather than 20. That's what we're trying to find. That's what this video is about, and this is what the work is about. At least a lot of the work is about doing this, searching for the right ratios. And so a major dynamic here is between money and labour. You do a certain amount of labour and it produces a certain amount of money. And then that money enables you to take on more labour, which will produce more labour. Now, this might sound all very alienating, and in a certain sense it is, but it's very important that we understand that the creation of a mass movement is this process, right? A mass movement cannot be produced in a sustainable way, at least, without an infrastructure which requires money. So to talk more bluntly, if young people, maybe a 22-year-old or 25-year-old is watching this video, they know they can't work full-time for the revolutionary change because they've got to pay their rent. Okay, so they need money. They don't need loads of money, but they do need money. So where does that money come from? Does it come from some rich people? Yes, it might initially, but a sustainable movement to create systemic change is not going to endlessly get money from idiosyncratic rich people who want to give you money. It needs to be self-sustaining, which means people need to pay their £10 a month. And how do you get people to pay their £10 a month? Well, we need to do A, B and C. So we need to look at what those A, B and C elements are. Otherwise, you're just doing your little local project with 20 people, which is cool, but that's not going to stop fascism. That's the sort of blunt message here. All right. So how does that happen? It happens through piloting and repeating pilots. Well, a pilot or a prototype is you go into the social space. You know, my word social space basically means, you know, you go out of the house and you do stuff. You go and do a petition, you go and sit in the road, you go and lobby a councillor, you go and knock on doors, you know, whatever it is. You're doing stuff in a social matrix, right? Lots of different things are happening. People are talking to each other. There's all these connections and causal relationships. It's all complex and what have you. And you go, okay, we're going to do this. And then it doesn't work. And that's good, of course, because then you know that doesn't work, so you don't need to do it again. You can do something else. Or more often, you do a little bit of some, it half works, right? It's like annoying. It half works and it half doesn't work. And then you think, okay. So then you tweak it and then you iterate again. And this is what I've been doing for 10 years. And if you want to know the secret of the successes, what I've done and other people have done that I'm in teams with, it's all about this process. It's not about, and we'll talk about this a bit more, it's not about going, well, we're going to spend 6 months thinking about it as if we can map out the complex social space and they go bang, 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 bang and win. It's about doing a certain amount of thinking and then actually going into the social space to get more information, because you can't get that information unless you do it, right? This is a really important point. This is not mechanical engineering, right? It's not where you completely predict the situation. Obviously, in modern society, you've got massive complexity, and humans, dare I say, are massively complex anyway, right? So you're not going to be able to sort it out. You need to do a certain amount of work, and then you off you go, and you go and make a lot of mistakes. So I'm going to briefly talk about the human nature element of it. Again, I've talked about this in other videos. You can watch Designing Revolution, the first 5 episodes, 6 episodes, I think, talk about this in some detail. But it's important to recognise there's 2 determinants of mobilisation: sociability and proximity. And different people use different words here. But sociability means if you bring people together and they are relating, concretely speaking, they're speaking to each other, people listening, people talking, more listening, more talking, as opposed to one person talking to lots of people. You create this sociability, people start liking each other, they relax, they start trusting each other, and you build the texture, as you might say, through which mass mobilisation takes place. This trust building, people knowing each other, etc. Proximity is pretty straightforward. It means how close are people in time. Are you doing something now and in 3 days' time, or you wait for a month? People aren't going to be that concerned. They've half forgotten about it. There's emotional proximity. Are you actually connected, or do they realise you're human, or is it just like a real transactional relationship? And then there's proximity in space, or do you have to go 3 miles to a meeting? If so, you're not going to go, right? And a second sort of key design principle is not telling people what to do, or at least not telling people what to do unless you're dealing with people that are really interested in the information or there's a lot of trust. So there's always a contradiction in these videos because I'm just sitting here telling you what to do. But that's in a particular context. You've decided to watch this video. I'm not imposing myself upon you. So this is as opposed, for instance, to a public meeting where the people have come, they don't really know what's happening, and then suddenly there's some guy, usually of my demographical profile, going, everyone, I'm going to talk to you for an hour, and that doesn't really work very well, particularly if I'm saying this is the truth and you've got to follow me, or all that sort of stuff. Key person here, like the grandfather, as it were, of sort of effective bottom-up left is Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educationalist. Pedagogy of the Oppressed is your homework. If you haven't read that book, go and read it. So the idea here is that you create, there's a fundamental difference between two ideas on the left. So the traditional idea, the Leninist idea, is you have the truth and you're going to impose that truth upon the social space, upon the workers, upon the community, upon the poor, because after all, you're right, because you're scientific and Marx was right and all this sort of stuff. And it works in so much as you can threaten to break people's legs if they don't agree with you, and you can create a big totalitarian system. But as we know, that's not particularly ethically interesting, let's put it like that. And then you've got the Paulo Freire meta tradition, which is, no, you go to the people and you sit in the room and you shut up and they speak. And through that speaking, they radicalise anyway, but in an authentic, collective, self-controlled way. And because of that, they'll turn up and they'll do things because they're self-motivated. So there's a little sort of subplot here, which I'll mention, which is quite important to deal with, which is that, am I just manipulating people, right, to be blunt? So there was this professor of communication a few years ago, and I did this presentation. I've been working in this sort of field for a long time. I was going, well, if you do this, this will happen. And she was going, well, Roger, this is just manipulation. And of course, whenever someone criticises you in a bit of a silly way, there's always a kernel of truth. There's intrinsically some element of manipulation, because there's some element of manipulation in all social interaction. Let's be honest with ourselves, right? You present things in a particular way because you want people to do things. But there's limits, as there is to all things. So a certain degree of manipulation doesn't mean you're being manipulative. It just means you're just trying to get some things done. But there's a broader issue, which is this invisibility of the manipulation of the neoliberal space. In other words, there's already manipulation going on because people feel like you have to get on, they have to conform, they have to get a mortgage, you have to get married. This is a structural manipulation that destroys the sense of creativity, spontaneity, happiness, all this sort of thing in the human population due to capitalist, neoliberal, whatever you want to call it, pressure. It's an important thing to recognise that we're not looking here at a blank slate. It's not like Roger Hallam comes in and designs the social space. The social space is already doing its thing. It's already destroying lives, right? In very real ways through emotional manipulation, economic manipulation and such like. Okay, so really there's this professor of communication, I propose a sort of counter ideology, which again is well known, which is the sort of psychological social repression ideology, which is, look, all these people are having a shit life. And the reason they're having a shit life is because they're all repressed because they can't do what they want to do. And what you're doing then is coming along, and when you design, manipulate, according to critiques. What you're actually doing is liberating people so that they can do what they actually really want to do. In other words, they can form a collectivity. In other words, one of the main ways in which the bad guys do bad things is by removing agency, collective agency. And from a neoliberal point of view, this isn't that important because they see the human simply as an atomized entity that makes individual decisions. You go into the supermarket, you buy oranges rather than apples. That makes you happy because you're individually fulfilled. And, you know, it's got stuff going for it. But on the left, as we all know, there's a counter critique, which is the human is also social. The key point here is if the human doesn't engage in the social, then they become mentally ill. In other words, we're not designed to just be atomized things in space. We're designed to have fixed social networks, and this is what gives us our mental health and our enjoyment of life and our zest and all the rest of it. And that's not happening because, as we all know, neoliberalism atomizes people. You're sitting in your bedsit watching Netflix, you're still on mum, you go to work, and you don't understand really why you feel miserable, but you sort of do because this life isn't really worth living and you're not really living a real life. These discussions and orientations have been going on at least 200 years, arguably thousands of years, and it's a big flow of different points of view. Let me just give you a little example from the last 3 months. So I've been door knocking in this suburb of London called Brixton, and you knock on the doors, and these are cool people, they're left-wing, they're progressive, they enjoy being compassionate, pro-social, they want great things to happen that are going to be good for people, etc. And they're really annoyed, they're really in despair, and they're really alienated. Why? Because they do not know how to sort out the social problems. Because the neoliberal system has said to them, you can't sort it out, and they don't see any pathway to sort it out. And so they say things to me like, well, obviously we can't do anything about that. It's really bad, but we can't do anything about that. Or it's a big structural thing. It's just the way things are. So you get this cynicism, and this eats away at the soul from, if you want to use a romantic sort of phraseology over it. What we're saying here is when we go into social space, we're not manipulating people, we're liberating people, right? That's the idea. And sure, the manipulation point, there's an element of truth, right? But the main show is the liberation narrative. Okay, so the last point on this sort of theory section is about revolution. So I've got this little sub-project to try and make revolution and being a revolutionary a normal thing. So in periods of the 19th century, for instance, liberal revolutionaries, if you went into a meeting in Barcelona or Mexico City and you sort of say, look, I'm a revolutionary, people wouldn't blink, right? There was loads of revolutionaries because things were really bad and people wanted to create systemic change, and so they called themselves revolutionaries. In the neoliberal period, the whole notion of revolution has become like a bit of a joke because of the end of history thesis, which basically says everything's fine, we don't need to have structural change, and if you're a revolutionary, you're just a bit of an idiot, right? You're just a romantic phase. Well, of course, in actuality, the neoliberal period is an aberration in terms of the last 250 years. Most of that 250 years has been full of people going, actually, I'm a revolutionary because major change has to happen. So at the moment, my argument is there's a cultural lag, as you might call, that objectively we should have loads of revolutionaries. We're not going to sort out the problems without systemic change. And instead, we've got this horrible phrase, activist, or I hate the word activist, because this is a neoliberal word, I would argue, where you're going, okay, so everything's broadly okay, and there's these, quaint little activists who come along who create a little bit of policy change and make a little bit of a fuss, but everyone else is just getting on with the main show. It's like there's activists and then there's other people that aren't activists, but of course they're activists as well because they're destroying the world, so there's nothing more active than actively destroying the world. And then it's important, I think, with the word revolutionary, people either think it's totally stupid or they think it's a sort of far left, romantic, posters on the wall, ridiculous. We want to change everyone. We want to force everyone into, joint childcare, what it is, there's all these films on it and all the rest of it. The middle way of what revolution could and should refer to is simply a sociological political category of people that want to change the constitution. So this is a bit of a reductive definition, but I think it's useful because what it's saying is we don't want policy change. What we want is a change in the system that creates policy. And there's a fairly clear division here. So a reformist orientation, activist orientation is you get your people into parliament or you lobby parliament and parliament make the decisions. The revolutionary system change orientation is you change the nature of that parliament. For instance, you get rid of the House of Lords in the UK because it's aristocratic and you have a new way of organising who makes decisions. Or you don't have voting for parliament, you have sortition, people are selected randomly in the population, which we'll come on to. That's a revolution. So revolution in actuality is nothing utopian about it. It's not like saying everyone's going to be in ecstasy all the time. What it means is it's more just. It's not utopianly just. It's more just. It's more effective, and it stops the end of the human race and massive collapse. That's it. That's all we're saying when we say we want to have a revolution or revolutionary change. And obviously, revolutionary change doesn't have to be violent. It goes without saying, there's plenty of revolutions which aren't, and arguably, or not arguably, but more or less certainly, if a revolution is violent, it's not going to be a revolution. So the next bit is going to be on the mobilisation. So when I say mobilisation in the context of what we're going to talk about in this video, I'm talking about the mobilisation of local community, geographical area. And obviously, incidentally, there's lots of different types of areas. So I'm broadly looking at mobilising depressed rural towns, small city areas, big city areas, where there's a high level of alienation and general progressive orientations, let's put it like that. Obviously, there's an issue about how to mobilise people and deal with far-right dynamics in other areas, which I'm not going to deal with much in this video. What I'm looking at here is getting our guys on the go, right? All these people in Brixton that are depressed because they can't see a pathway towards collective action. So that's the project, and this arguably will be enough to create structural change or put us in the ballpark of an Endgame situation. What myself and others have been trying to work on here, I suppose, is how do you get this to go quickly? And that very orientation contradicts the default ideology of local community action, as you might say. So for most of the neoliberal period, the general assumption, and this is quite a big prejudice, I suppose, is that if you're going to go into a community, you have to do a bunch of years' work. So this is called the community mobilising model or community organising model. And it has a lot going for it. So just before I start criticising it, I obviously have enormous respect for all these people that have been trying to get their communities on the go year in, year out. They've got deep cultural connective roots, networking in their communities, and they're great people, right? And at the same time, that's not the totality from an Adorno point of view. There is something out there. There is the potentiality for rapid mobilisation, which, of course, itself has a bunch of downsides. So the general thesis here is, in response to the far right, the community organising model is not going to produce the level of mobilisation, collective action and collective power required to effectively mobilise people for structural change. There's three problems. The first problem is people just want to go slow. We'll have a meeting next month, this sort of culture. The second problem is people don't want to engage in confrontation. Again, when it's knocking on doors in Brixton, there's various middle class people who are quite well up in the community, and their general view is, look, if you create confrontation in the community, it starts to fall apart. It's dangerous. Social fabric is very fragile and we just all need to work together. And again, there's no doubt that that has something going for it. And at the same time, there's the counter idea that if you're just trying to work with everyone all the time and the whole system's degenerating, you actually get what you don't want, which is a big explosion into a riot, because there's no ongoing systematic approach of confrontation. In other words, if you have no confrontation, then you're just going to have an explosion. Far better to have some confrontation in the system, which quite rightly has to be nuanced and limited. You don't want to blow the whole show up in any way. But confrontation in and of itself is not opposed to the notion of a sort of non-violent, iterative process of improvement in a local social environment. And then the third thing is this slightly irrational, sort of hobbit orientation. That's not the word I was looking for. But this orientation that we're just the common people and we don't stand in elections. The people that stand in the elections are the conventional parties, the big boys, the political people, the Labour Party, the Tories, reform people. Us community activists, we just go and do a demo, we go and talk to the councillors, and we're just the peasants, basically. But of course, this is contradicted by the obvious democratic point that anyone could, and therefore arguably should, stand in an election. What's the big deal? It's a democracy. If I want to stand in an election, then who's to stop me? People go, oh, you're splitting the left, or, oh, you shouldn't be doing that, you should be leaving it to other people. Then, yeah, it's an opinion, but it's not like I'm a citizen, I can stand in an election, why not? So there seems to be this sort of irrational cultural resistance to it within the space. And of course, there's lots of dangers of standing in elections, which we'll come on to. These are some of the things, the inertias that I'm going to try and argue against in the next half hour or so. And sometimes, of course, there's a big break. So the day after I got out of prison, I went to see Zara Sultana because, as many people watching this video will know, there was this Your Party thing and they got 800,000 sign-ups. And I wrote this book in the last 10 days of prison, this little book called Grasping the Enormity of the Moment. Go and read it, just give it another plug. And I was saying, right, okay, so you get 800,000 people, then you can turn that into 1.5 million people, and you get them all going, knocking on doors, and there's a fairly simple system using Zoom calls, and you win the next election, okay. But as many people watching know, it didn't turn out like that for various reasons, which I'm not going to go into here. But sometimes a rupture, there's a break in the system, and you can really speed this up. So in between that sort of super fast track scenario and the steady as we go scenario, we've got the scenario that I'm going to talk about now, which is a proactive going into a local space and doing A, B, and C, and coming out with some major rupture, proactive, pro-social rupture, which is what we're aiming for. So what does that look like? The first thing to say about it is I'm going to give you a scenario. I'm going to give you a bunch of numbers. These numbers are not written in stone. When I was in prison, I wrote a book called Assemblies and Revolutions. I put a bunch of numbers in there, and actually quite a lot of them are wrong. So the point here is not that the numbers are accurate. The point is they may well be accurate, and in so much as they're not, we need to find the numbers that are accurate. But the numbers are important because they create this specificity about how you actually do it. So instead of doing all this warm words, there's 100 videos out there where it will say to you, well, you go into a local community and you mobilise people and you talk to them. It's like, great, but that only gets you so far, as we all know, in terms of the practicality. What we want to know is on Wednesday evening, you go out door knocking, and what's the returns? How many people do you speak to? How many people go into the meeting? Okay, and then you reiterate it. How does it build up so that you can take control of the local council, which is what we're going to talk about. This is what we need to do. It's not the whole show, but it's a big part of it. Okay, so I'm, got a bit of a reputation for being a bit fast and furious. It's got its pros and cons, but that's broadly what I am, in the sense that I will come up with an idea. I've been thinking about this, as I said, with lots of other people, for about 3 years. But when I'm going into a space, when I design something, I don't spend a lot of time designing. When I set something up, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. I spend some time thinking about it. I'm just going to talk to other people in the space. But I'm, for the sake of argument, going to spend 3-6 hours writing it out like this talk, because I'm moving fast, because there's a lot to do. So with the Brixton scenario, there were 3 or 4 of us that were involved initially. We were all going to do 15-30 hours a week. In other words, this is something that you know, some person listening to this in Lyon or Budapest or, you know, San Francisco, my argument is going to be, you can actually do this if you do A, B and C. You can take over your local space, which then provides this structural opportunity for doing big systemic things on top of this success. Or maybe not, but it very arguably is in the ballpark. What's the idea here? The idea is we're not doing community organising in that sort of slow sense. So what are the positive reasons for going fast? So I think there are 3 reasons why going fast works. Again, this is not therefore always go fast. It's more like there's 2 sides to the argument. So the first reason is the collective action problem. So the collective action problem is you're knocking on all the doors in the street and everyone wants something to happen, but it's not happening because everyone's sad and miserable and they're not connected. In other words, no one wants to go and do door knocking because door knocking is a waste of time. But if 10 people are going door knocking, suddenly it would make sense for all those people. And this is largely a coordination problem in the sense that Mrs. Jones doesn't know that Mr. Harris up the road will also go door knocking with her, because they never talk about it because they're all sad and miserable in their bedsits going, ooh, you know, there's no point doing door knocking because no one likes doing door knocking. People like doing door knocking as and even when there's 100 door knockers. Then it becomes sexy and exciting and sociable and, you know, proximity dynamics and all takes off. In other words, like what you've got to do is go around that community really, really fast and get everyone involved really quickly, because then they can see everyone else getting involved really quickly because of proximity dynamics. It's like, oh, we've done 50 streets in a weekend. Oh my goodness, right. So they're doing it. Oh yeah, they're doing it. You see what I mean? It all speeds up and everyone gets excited about it, right? So that's one thing that's going on, which is related to the second point, which is about drama. If you're going fast, then suddenly everyone starts talking about you. You know, if you did a meeting about an assembly, you know, in January, and then you said, well, we'll have the next assembly in April, it's like no one's going to be talking about that on the high street. If you're on the high street, like every day, you know, doing petitions, and you get to 5,000 petitions in 2 weeks, then you tell people on the street that, hey, we've got, you know, 10,000 names in the last 2 weeks, whatever it is. Then people are going to cognitively remember that because that's unusual. And then they're going to talk to other people and they're going to talk to other people. If you've got, you know, you've gone round your neighbourhood and you've got 100 people in the meeting, or you put up 300 posters like we'll come and talk about, 150 people come to a meeting, like 95% of meetings have 10 to 20 people. If 150 people come to it, it's a drama, it's a talking point. People talk about it and suddenly 10 to 20% of people in the local area know about you, know about your brand, know about what you're doing because you've gone fast, because that's how you get 150 people in the room. And the last dynamic is if you don't move quickly, the organisation takes over the cause. So this is called bureaucratisation or inertia in the system. In other words, people identify with the organisation rather than the activity and the aim. So people will go, and I'm sure, you know, everyone's familiar with this dynamic. You go to the meeting, you go, oh, we should do something innovative. And everyone goes, ooh, that's a bit risky. That's a bit risky. You know, what we need to think about is the future of the organisation, the sustainability of the organisation. This is going to cause a danger, a risk to the organisation. Maybe the police will do us in. Maybe the population will turn against us. Maybe we'll lose that council contract. You know, everyone's vulnerable. And this is a massive dynamic, as we all know, in the neoliberal space, is everyone's basically a slave to the system because if anyone moves in an unusual way, you lose your funding, you lose your credibility, usually reputation. Better to be on the cautious side. Everyone goes on the cautious side, and the far right wins because they don't do that, right? They move fast. So in actual fact, the sort of cautious thing becomes the more risky thing in the context of the existential threat, in the context of the far right, in the context of massive, exponentially increasing inequality, bankruptcy of the state, and all the rest of it. So incidentally, this is why we're calling ourselves revolutionaries. Revolutionaries move fast, right? Revolutionary activity is not community organising. It's about going to the space, cause disruption. I'm not talking about Bolsheviks or anything. I'm talking about Martin Luther King going to Selma. You see the film, there's a scene in the film where he goes, we've come to Selma, there's the community organisers there, they're doing great work, but with all due respect, they're not getting very far, right? They're trying to register black people. It's happening, but it's really slow. Why is it really slow? Because there's no speed, there's no drama. Take it one step at a time sort of philosophy. Martin Luther King comes into the room and says, what we do is disruption. And they're going, ooh, ooh, ooh. And he's going, well, that's what we do, right? And we move fast and we break things. And I don't mean in the violent sense, but we basically disrupt the sort of inertia of the system. And that provides, from this social repression point of view, this upsurgence of enthusiasm because everyone's going, oh my God, maybe there's some hope. Maybe something's going to happen. So in other words, it like scales fast. All right, so that's like the introduction to this mobilisation campaign. What are we trying to do? Move fast. So then we're using more elements of the theory to design it. So there's a bunch of steps. I'm not quite sure how many there is. I think there's about 4 or 5 steps. So step 1 is listening. So you go into the community. Concretely, that means you choose a certain area. Let's say there's 40 streets in the area and you knock on the doors. So the first fundamental design point here is you're not knocking on the doors going, hi, I'm Roger, I'm a socialist. We believe in social equality in Brixton and we want to promote policies A, B and C. We would like you to come and join our group and we would like you to vote for us and we would like you to agree with us because basically we're right. So let's say you are right, but that's not the issue. And quite possibly you're wrong, of course. But let's say you are right, but that's not the issue. The issue is about the theory of human nature. The human is, from a Paulo Freire point of view, if you remember what I was saying, basically radicalizes to the point that they self-create themselves, or they collectively create themselves. So in terms of the micro dynamic of on the doorstep, the fundamental realization is to the extent that the person who you're talking to is able to speak, they will warm to you and decide to do what you're suggesting within reason, obviously, and over a statistically significant set of circumstances. Obviously, there's going to be long tails where people, shut the door on you or go, oh, you're wonderful without ever saying anything. But the middle group are basically going to go, if I can talk about my situation, I'm going to feel happy, I'm going to feel engaged, I'm going to be open to you, and I'm going to go and do something which isn't a big deal, go to a meeting or sign a petition or whatever it might be. So what we did in Brixton, and by the way, I'm going to talk about Brixton quite a lot if you're from Brixton or from London. This is not a Brixton thing particularly, it's not a London thing, it's a Western city thing. I'm trying to make this generalised across loads of different situations. So I'm only using Brixton as an example, as you might say. I'm not saying Brixton is X, Y, and Z. All right, so concretely, what does it mean? You knock on the door and you go, hi, my name's Roger, I'm from a community project. We've got a few questions we'd just like to ask you. Would it be okay? And it takes a second. How long have you lived in the area? You just get into a bit of a chat. Oh, you lived a long time. Oh, dental on my bum. And then you've got the 2 main questions, which is, so what are the 1 or 2 good things about Lambeth area, about London area, or about your locality? And they're going to go, in Brixton, they're going to go, well, there's a vibrant culture, it's good communications, you get on the tube, this sort of thing, shops are great. And then you say, okay, and then there's the 1 or 2 things that could be improved, things which aren't so good. And they go, well, there's this problem, there's this problem, you discuss it with them. And then you say, well, lots of people in the area are going to this public meetup where there's going to be assembly format. You can sit down and discuss things in small groups. It's really pleasant. You meet people in the community. Would you be into doing that? Here's a leaflet. Thank you very much. So again, this isn't the only way of doing it, but I'm giving you this level of detail so you've got an idea of that the detail counts, right? You know, knocking on door, you're asking that question. Maybe it needs to be another question. You're asking about their experience. You're empathizing with them. So no doubt improvements can be made of it, but we did this 3,000 times on the doorstep in about 6 or 7 weeks. And as you can imagine, we got a fair idea of where people are at in that community. And that, in other words, gives you the information you're not going to get by sitting in a room trying to work it out. Don't overthink it. Go out, knock on the doors, find out. So what we did in this situation is we had about 8 assemblies. We were going for 8 weeks, and we did an assembly, or a meetup as we called it, once a week. And we went out for 20 hours of door knocking, something like that. And it wasn't that great, right? 10, 15 people turned up. So again, you can see this non-linear thing is most people, or if you're not aware of non-linearity, you're going to go, after 4 weeks, you're going to go, hey, Roger, this really isn't working. 5 people turned up to that meeting, it's not going to work. But what you have to understand is you're building the first little feedback loops of people going, do you know those people? They've actually done another assembly. Oh, then they've done another. In other words, slowly people are talking about it. Slowly people are going, oh, these people are quite interesting. You know, people are a bit threatened, maybe a bit curious, but you're getting attention. If you just do one assembly and then do another one 3 months later, it's death, right? Who cares? And it just doesn't matter. If you just do 3 assemblies and stop, well, it's just these outsiders coming in and doing some weird little experiment on local people. It's like, no. It's got a rhythm to it. It's got a dynamism, a momentum. Every Thursday, an assembly. Next week, another assembly. Next week, another assembly, right? And people are starting to get sucked into this vortex, as you might say, of attention in the attention economy of the human space, as you might call it. It's no big deal, right? It's people turning up, having a little bit of a chat. It's no big shakes. But there's a point at which you go, okay, this is the big issue for this area. So across the Western world, you don't need to be a genius to work out what these issues are. There's food, there's income, there's housing. What it was in Brixton was homelessness, addiction and mental health, which were derivative, of course, of the housing crisis. Not entirely, but it had this sort of this connection. The upshot of it is what by Assembly 3, the 3 of us had this discussion. We said, right, we know what the campaign is going to be. In other words, like, this was step 2. So there's no point doing a whole bunch of assemblies, and this is another major error with all due respect, is people do assemblies and go, oh, these are big issues, and do more assemblies, oh, these are big issues. And it's like, okay, we've done some assemblies, what next? And often, of course, in a sort of neoliberal campaigning, reformist, community organising sort of way, that's it. That's all that happens. And then if at worst, this creates even more alienation because people were drawn into this deal and then nothing happened and you just get even more pissed off and cynical. I'm not going to an assembly because they don't lead to anything. Well, maybe, but obviously maybe not, because an assembly doesn't mean nothing happens. You can design something to come next. The point here is this move fast sort of momentum driven idea is based upon you don't just move fast in each little step. You're not doing an assembly each week and then that's it. There's also a mid-level design. You've got the next thing that's coming along and you know what's coming along. And the next level, you already know you're going to do a campaign and you're going to know what those people want because you've knocked on 3,000 doors. The upshot of it is in the Brixton case study, which is ongoing, by the way, it was obvious it was going to be homelessness, addiction, mental health. Okay, then it gets interesting because, as I said, at that point, it's all looking a little bit like a load of work for not much return. But then we pivot, as it were, and we go, okay, we're going to not just do door knocking, we're going to put 300 posters up because we've heard about this good practice from other people. Like in Norwich, they put 100 posters up and got 100 people to the meeting. So myself and the guy I'm working with, we said, right, we're going to put 300 posters up. The 300 posters go up saying, homelessness, mental health, addiction, this is a big issue. Brixton, is getting its act together. Let's go and have this big meeting. So it's in a community centre, and this is the first big data point, right? 150 people turn up. So as many people know, you have a local meeting, you have issue X, 20 people turn up, 30 people turn up, but 150 people turned up. So we don't know exactly why that happened, but here's a few ideas. First of all, you've got this momentum building. People talking about you, but not just any people. People who are might call political and social influencers in the space. People that run the Facebook groups along the streets. People that are involved in local politics. So you've already got a bit of a reputation that you are people that do things. And then when you're holding this big meeting, start the campaign, then they already know about who you are. It's not like some groups come out of nowhere. Those are those people. They're interesting people. They do things. Let's turn up. So there's that dynamic. The second dynamic is there's posters. Lots of people see posters. Like Brixton's the high street's very busy. People street are wandering along it. And so people are seeing it, right? But they're also seeing it because there's 300 posters. So what 300 posters do, it's a bit like the Coca-Cola principle. I don't know if it's called that, but when you see big corporate posters, it's really boring, isn't it? Because you see the same poster over and over and over again. Why is that? Because the psychologists know that if you see one poster, you have 1/100th of a second of attention and you forget it again. But if you see that poster 4-10 times in a day, the number of people that are going to register it cognitively goes up to, let's say, 20%, which is a massive amount of the population. So if you go and post, you don't want to put 2 posters on, you need to put 50 posters on, because then 20% of the street is going to cognitively click that poster and what's happening. And then 1% of those people are going to turn up to the meeting. And if you do your maths, that's why 150 people turned up. But then there's another dynamic on top of that non-linear dynamic, which is the non-linearity that happens because of the non-linearity. In other words, you're a community activist in Brixton and you go, oh yeah, there's those weird people doing those assemblies. And then you hear it from someone else, and then you hear it from someone else. And then suddenly you start talking to other people about it and it cascades through the social space. And before you know it, people have heard about it 6 times. And if they hear about it 5 times, that's the tipping point where they go, actually, I won't go to the pub tonight. I'll actually go to that meeting because it sounds quite interesting because Joe told me about it and Jack told me about it. So when we had the meeting, strangely enough, there were, I think, 4 councillors there and 2 MPs. We didn't write to them. It was just their political people in their network heard about it. And no doubt they rang up and said, oh, the peasants are revolting. Potentially you better turn up and, dampen the enthusiasm, which we'll come on to in a minute. But you can see how this happens, right? If you think it's a mystery, it's because you're thinking in linear terms. In certain circumstances, things go non-linear, and it's all a function of this going fast and furious and getting loads of things happening in a limited space, in a limited time. So what happened then? 150 people turned up. We had to turn people away. The meeting was a bit problematic because this is the problem with non-linear growth. You sort of don't expect so many people to turn up. You have the problem of too many people rather than the problem of not enough people. The long and short of it was the meeting was great. People signed up for stuff. People started talking to each other. There's a little sort of side plot here, which I think I'll mention, which is there's 2 groups in the social space. And I'm going to talk analytically here, so I'm not trying to upset anyone. There's 2 groups that basically slow down the non-linear growth. So the first group I will call sort of middle-class empowered administrator people, right? So these are people who basically run the local social space. They're the people that run the charities, they run the social organisations, the council organisations, the political parties. They've been around for 30 years. They know how things work. They know Brixton, all this sort of culture. So when all these people meet together, basically it's a threat, subliminally or explicitly, because they know new things will come out of the creativity of the assembly. And so what they do, either intentionally or subliminally, is try and disrupt that so that the natural process of empowerment doesn't happen through the assembly format. So an example of this is one of the councillors, stood up and said, well, I'm the councillor, I'm an important person, or words to that effect. I need to talk to the assembly. So my friend who was organising the assembly was going, no, please sit down. That's not how it works. Everyone's supposed to be talking to each other in small groups. But he broke that rule because he wanted to, of course, because he wanted to establish his power and control over the social space, because that's what he's about and that's what he assumes is his privilege. So then he gives some generalised warm word speech about how he's working really hard and the homelessness issue is very difficult and such like, which of course is probably true. He probably is working very hard. I mean, maybe not, but maybe. And obviously homelessness is difficult. But the general idea here is to prevent newness, prevent creativity, create excitement, because that's dangerous, because it's new and ultimately he may lose his power, which is probably true, as it will turn out. And then there's what you might call like intellectual space. So these are people that are purists. I've talked about this in other videos, in the sense that they're addicted to the critique. In other words, whatever happens, there's problems, have you thought of this? Are you not being radical enough? Are you being too radical? In other words, these are the people that ask endless questions. They'll stand up and they won't propose anything. They'll just ask endless questions, which makes them feel very clever. And no doubt they are very clever. But cleverness does not produce the revolution. What produces the revolution is naivety, right? In other words, hey, this is cool. We're not going to think about it that much. If you overthink about things, then you end up not doing anything because you think of all these defeatist reasons why it's not a good idea. So the point about these two groups is if you're moving slowly, these two groups will have time to react to you. And when you have public meetings, they will stand up and disrupt them, or they'll join your groups and go, well, I think we need to slow down here, we need a constitution, or hang on, we need to discuss what Marx would say, or something like this. So you haven't got the momentum is what enables you, what I would call, to break through the membrane, is that the right word? The membrane, into the actual social space itself. And the membrane is the gatekeeper slither. These are the people who will claim to speak on behalf of the community. And again, no doubt they do good work and no doubt they're decent people and all the rest of it, or maybe not. But in order to get a non-linear takeoff in a social space, in local space, those gatekeepers have to be manoeuvred around. Not in a nasty way, but just in a functional way that otherwise it's not going to happen, because they'd slow it down for the reasons we've just discussed. So we sort of broke through that space because we had 150 people in the meeting. Then we started having people going out talking to people that are homeless, had people doing social media stuff. We had people doing community outreach, talking to lots of groups in the community. And we had another group doing petitions, standing on the high street. And then the whole idea was then we were going to go and see the council, see what they were going to say. So the nice thing about this, of course, is that you've got this growth. You've got all these working groups, people are joining the WhatsApp group, and then there's lots of little groups within the WhatsApp group and people can take it away. And you haven't got, there's no ability for the gatekeeper type people to stop it because there's no space for them to stop it, as you might say. Okay, so let's talk about the petition a little bit. And this is a classic example of pivoting. So the original design in Assemblies and Revolutions, and I'm not saying this is totally a bad design, but the original design was you do your door knocking, people would come to the assemblies, then they'd go door knocking for you, give money, the money would pay for your costs, it paid for more full-time people to organise more volunteers, to go do more door knocking, to have more assemblies, to produce more money and door knocking, Anyway, that didn't really happen because the momentum, the credibility and the momentum didn't really get to scale. Now, that might have been partially because of the particularities of that context, and in the sense that we coming from the outside, and we didn't have that many network connections. While in other places, like some friends in Totnes and Norwich, they've quite quickly got lots of people in the room and giving money and volunteering because they already have the credibility of being in the social space and people know about them and they have those connections. So what did we do here? What we had was a certain amount of funding. So we had to move pretty fast to try and work out how we were going to monetize it, as you might say. And this is what we came up. We basically pivoted, or we stumbled, to be honest, upon a new way of doing it, which was the use of the petition. Now, obviously, some of you may know, I've said bad things about petitions in the past. So you think, oh, he's contradicting himself. But the point about the petition is, again, contextual. If you have, a petition and people go on for 2 seconds and it goes to the government, it's not going to be that great. What's interesting about a petition in this context is it's visceral. It's actually a piece of paper you're going to sign in a street. Secondly, it's ultra local. Basically, we just took petitions from one street where homelessness was really bad, the high street in Brixton. So then you're building up, first of all, lots of people are signing it because everyone on that street knows how bad the homelessness problem is. Secondly, it's got this material aspect to it. And thirdly, it's a local thing. You're not trying to influence the government. Obviously, the government isn't going to react to a petition. But a local council might do, particularly if, for the sake of argument, 20% of the local population has signed a petition. It's a major act of democratic pressure. So all these elements are combined. We've got like 6,000 petitions in 5 weeks, something like that. We're aiming for 10,000. That's going to be 1,000 pieces of paper, sheets of A4. Maybe we're going to stick them to the council building. Maybe we're going to bang them on the table. There's this sort of visceral element to it. I think the Chartists did this in the 19th century. There were like 2 million petitions, and he went with all the pieces of paper to the aristocracy in the 1830s and said, come on, we want electoral reform or whatever it was. So it becomes like, it's a mobilizing mechanism within itself. And this is the main point here, is what we ask people to do is once they signed a petition, then they put their phone over a QR code and they joined the WhatsApp group, which meant we had a telephone number and we could telephone them. And again, the manipulation people go, oh, this is very manipulative. No, it's not. What we're doing is basically deepening the social connectivity. You're on the street, people are busy, they're going to the tube, they've only got time to write their name down, put their phone over, it takes 5 seconds. This is not a good space to start having a conversation. But when you phone them up, then you can have a conversation. Thank you so much for signing the petition. Here's the information about the campaign. This is important. What's your experience? We're doing really well, but we don't have any money. Would you consider giving £1 or £2 a week? Because this genuinely keeps the campaign on the go. And would you be interested in volunteering, taking petitions yourself? Okay, so basically then we get the ratios, and the ratios turned out to be, for every hour of phoning, you get around £5 to £10, let's say, for an average £8 of people giving a monthly donation. And every 2 hours of phoning, you get one person to volunteer to do 2 hours of petitioning in the high street. Okay, I mean, you probably get more people, well, you do get more people saying they're interested in volunteering, but in terms of carrying on, that's our estimate, that there's one person every 2 hours. But if you're out doing 20 hours of petitioning, let's say, per week, you've got 10 hours of phoning, let's say, so you're attracting 5 more volunteers per week. They're all going to do 2 hours of petitioning. So that's 10 hours of petitioning. And so you're moving from 20 hours of petitioning to 30 hours to 40 hours to 50 hours. In other words, this is the dynamo, right? We've discovered dynamo. We've got the labour dynamo and we've got the money dynamo. The labour dynamo is, hey, do you want to volunteer? Get more people doing the petitioning, more money, more volunteers. The money dynamo is, hey, we can afford to pay Joe to do this full time, to phone the skilled job, phone the volunteers up and make sure all the stand is looking nice and all the rest of it. So the general direction of travel is, although this started off as some little project, a few, 3 guys knocking on doors, 10 people in an assembly, suddenly it jumps to this little non-linear tipping point, 150 people in the room, and then suddenly you've got this petition, which leads to more volunteers, leads to £1,000 a month, maybe £2,000 a month for regular donations. Then the next step, which hasn't happened yet, so we're going into unknown territory, is, okay, we make this a London campaign, or we make this a all San Francisco campaign, or an all Lyon campaign. And what we're doing is then we're going around the whole city, wherever there's lots of people, we're going, hey, will you sign a petition to get, Council X to put more support into helping people on the street, helping homelessness, addiction, mental health. Oh yes, I'll sign that petition. Thanks very much. QR code, thanks. Got the telephone number, give them a ring. So then you've got 10 teams around London doing it. It's a whole London campaign. It's gained momentum. It's got credibility. You're starting to get brand recognition for the campaign. And then you've got more labour, more money, and da. So that's a little bit of a sort of sideline here. And incidentally, I've talked to the Take Back the Power people at this moment, in December 2025. They started this big campaign. There's elements of civil disobedience, elements of sort of theatre in it, general mobilising, going and doing talks. And it's all about taxing the rich, which arguably is the central policy, meta policy in Western democracies at the present time, right? So, I've done a sort of mobilisation plan where all around the country, people standing in the shopping centres, on the high streets, and they've got a little store, and they're going, will you sign a national petition to get the government to tax the rich properly, because it's shit that they're running off with all the money, isn't it? And I'm pretty sure 80% of people who are on a medium or less income are going to go, yeah, I'll sign that. And then they sign it, QR code, phone them up, give them a ring, direct them towards the rally, ask them to give a small donation, ask them to do more petitioning. So we're trying to get, 3 million petitions. You can see the direction of travel. So what we've discovered here is through the social, focusing on the social, i.e. what's, in front of your face, homelessness literally in front of your face, like people suffering on the streets because they haven't got enough support. And the biggest visceral social issue of our time, which is tax the rich properly, then you're going to get this mobilisation because people are so pissed off. In other words, because it's like a pre-revolutionary period where there's massive social repression. If we had a nice, sensible society, you wouldn't get these ratios. The reason you're getting these ratios is because people are pissed off and people are ready to engage in collective action. But you have to come in as a sort of collective action entrepreneur, as you might call it, using neoliberal language, to actually organise and coordinate these people so that then they suddenly feel they can participate in collective action because they know, hey, 10,000 other people have signed this petition. Oh, it's not just me that cares about homelessness. Oh, we're going to have a rally. Oh, this organisation's big, they've got credibility. I'll go to the rally or whatever it's going to be. Okay, so this is, as far as the Brixton case study has gone, this is as far as we've got. So up to this point, all the ratios are like, they're done. This can be replicated. It's going to be a Zoom call at the end of, this video. You can go on the Zoom call, you can find out about it, you can get all the documentation, all the nuts and bolts. And if you're in Banbury in the UK, you can do it. If you're in, wherever it is, Atlanta, US, you can do it, right? That's the proposition. And I'll talk about this later, but this thing can grow organically. Okay, but that's interesting, isn't it? It's great. Oh, Roger, great. You've got a petition. Okay, you're starting a campaign. Okay, great. You've got your local opponents. You can overcome them. You can go and have meetings with the councillors and say, this is what we want, da. But it's not system change, right? It's not a revolutionary strategy. And also, because of that, it's not going to work. Because when you go to the local councillors, you know what's going to happen. They're going to go, no, right? No, we're not going to do anything progressive because we're in debt and we don't really care and we get our backhanders from the bad guys and all the rest of it. So what we've been saying to people in Brixton, look, we're campaigners. We can build a campaign. We can do a go through the motions campaign, performative campaign, a neoliberal campaign where you get everyone together and you ask nicely and nothing much happens apart from performative process stuff where, you get to meet the MPs and it's great and it's lovely. But there's still like 1,000 homeless people on the streets of Brixton, right? So there's two avenues here structurally about what you do. So one avenue is the civil disobedience avenue, which, dare I say, I'm not allowed to talk about. So I'm not going to talk about it. But partially because, you can't do everything in a 2-3 hour video, and there's lots of other information out there about, you go to the council and you sit down, or you block the road, or you don't pay your council tax, or variations on the theme. But what I want to focus on in this video is the other thing, which is if the powers that be don't respond, at least in a democratic system, then, as they're always saying to you, why don't you stand in election? Okay, so let's stand in the elections. So in the Brixton case, what we did is we got these petitions and we had all these assemblies. And in the assemblies, we came up with a community aim. So this wasn't our idea. The 150 people in this meeting said, OK, what we want is we want the council to do A, B and C. A central idea is rough sleepers, people sleeping in the streets, is reduced by 75% by November next year. So something concrete, right? So we had this charter. It was about 5 or 6 pages. It's all beautifully done. My friend did it. It was lovely, and we took it along, like you do in how democracy is supposed to work. And you give it to the powers that be, and they look at it and they act upon it, because this has come out of 3,000 conversations on the doorstep, 10 assemblies, one big public meeting. It's got credibility. But of course, what happened is we went to hand it in and they locked the doors. I mean, you couldn't make it up, could you? But, we were going to hand it in at 4:30 or something. At 4 o'clock, they locked the doors because they knew we were coming. So that wasn't very nice of them. We had to give it to the security people. Okay, so that's step one. Step two was, okay, we wrote to 54, 58 Labour councillors in Lambeth, and we said, hey guys, we want to talk to you about these demands. We want to have a civilised conversation. This is what the people of Brixton want. And so we organised 3 meeting spaces, we sent the email out. These are the 3 options. One of them was in the town hall, so they didn't have to walk down the corridor. Anyway, so what happened next was they didn't turn up, right? Why didn't they turn up? Well, hopefully they just wanted us to go away, but then it started gaining traction on social media, so they decided they have to do some public relations routine. So they write, a lot of warm words about how they're doing great things on homelessness. Obviously, they're doing lots of great things on homelessness. The only problem is it's not getting sorted out. And then they go, oh, this is a political campaign because we're going to stand in elections and it's outsiders coming into the community, and, then implication they're nasty outsiders, which is a bit of a joke because Brixton's full of outsiders. Anyway, you can see the general neoliberal routine, right? Across all Western democracies, it's the same nowadays. As soon as you try and follow the rules, they just basically shit on you by going, we're not talking to you because we can get away with it because we're in power, you're not. Maybe they are going to have a meeting. If they knew a meeting, we all know what's going to happen. There's going to be lots of warm words, lots of smooching, lots of irrelevant detail. But the structural problem is still there. There's thousands of homeless people on the streets. People are getting screwed on their rent, Okay. So what do you do? What you do then is you stand in the election against them, right? This is the big move. The old way of standing in election goes like this. You go okay, so look, the council hasn't been very good. So we're going to put some independent candidates up. We don't have many resources. We need to take this step by step. And so let's say we put 3 councillors up in Lambeth. What's the logic? Number one step at a time. Number 2, we don't have that many resources. It's just some mini little campaign, right? So we're just going to put 3 things in. Why doesn't that work? It doesn't work because it doesn't understand non-linearity. If you're going to actually get Labour in Lambeth to do something serious, basically you're going to have to stand in every ward. There's 25 wards. Standing in 3 wards is what you might call performative electioneering. It's symbolic. So this is for instance, what the Green Party has been doing, for the last 20 years. So I've spoken to 2 Green parties recently in the UK, and it's they go, so these are our 5 target wards, or we're going to focus on those 3 wards in another place in London. And it's hang on a minute. We're facing the biggest social crisis, in a generation. We've got these existential risks. We've got the far right going to take power in major Western countries. you have to act as if, note the word as if, you're going to actually sort that out. And this is the dynamic. If you act as if you're actually going to sort out, then the labour and the money will follow that rhetoric and construction, because if you do that, you will sort it out, right? So there's lots that can be said about this, and it's all quite philosophical about determinism and causality and all the rest of it. But to cut a long story short, it becomes self-fulfilling. So let me give you another example. Straight after Christmas, I'm going to go out, I'm going to knock on doors, and I'm going to go, okay, we're going to put a candidate up in this ward. Do you want to come to the assembly to decide, to launch the campaign? If I just say that, let's say 1 in 100 people is going to come, maybe 1 in 50, right? If I knock on a door and say, hey, there's a massive momentum in Brixton, I don't know if you know, about putting candidates up in every ward to get rid of Labour. And we think we can wipe them out because we've done the maths. And loads of people are excited about this, and they're all coming to this meeting on Wednesday evening. Then 5-10 times more people will come because they're excited. And then it will be exciting because they came. You see how that works? So obviously you can push this too far and make ridiculous claims up. But there's like a sweet spot between boring, linear thinking and just ridiculously reckless, irresponsible talk, right? We're going to take down capitalism in Brixton, at the end of January. I don't think that's going to happen. But yes, it's perfectly possible that 100, 200 people are going to turn up, because it's just happened because we've got the case study of people turning up for the homelessness campaign. And then once they get into the room, then there's 100 people in the room rather than 20. So the whole ambience changes, as we all know. If you've got 20 people in the room, it's standard linear stuff, isn't it? It's just like, okay, we've got a campaign meeting, 20 people, blah, blah, blah. If it's 100 people in the room, it's a bit like, ooh, and then you say, okay, who's going to go door knocking? In order to win this ward, we need 20 door knockers, and we need them now, right? Will you put your hand up if 20 other people join you to go door knocking, twice a week for the next 5 weeks? And my prediction is, and we've got some stats on this, you've got 100 people in the room, you've got 20 regular door knockers coming out of it, right? So I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. But the main point is about this ambition, as they call it. I hate that word because it's not ambition. It's like doing what's necessary to save the world. You've got to have a big story. Again, to use the XR example, we didn't say, well, we're going to go to, the centre of London for a day and have a rally, and maybe some people sit in the road. It's just not interesting. 1,000 people are going to turn up. If we say, look, we're going to go to London and sit in the roads, and we're going to stay there until the Tory government actually does something, then 10,000 people turn up, because it's credible, it's a credible strategy, and it breaks through the collective action problem, which we've talked about. All right, so another thing to say about the election campaign is, whenever I mention this to people, people think it's an election campaign because I've said so. It's not an election campaign. In other words, we've got this reductive linear idea that, you go and knock on doors, you launch a meeting, you get your candidate, you knock on the doors and you win the election. And it's cognitively simple, and our lazy brains go, well, that's that, and it's not that interesting, right? It's good because it means we don't need to think. But that's not the strategy. The strategy is looking at what you might call the holistic causality in the space. In other words, when you do something in order to do something else. But you have loads of unintended surplus causal influences. So in other words, when you do this election campaign, a semi-unintended consequence is you're going to cheer a lot of people up. In other words, you're going to create fluidity, which is going to replace the hard cynicism, desperation and depression. And in that social fluidity, you have the potentiality to do something which is a lot more structural than just a neoliberal election campaign. So the strategy here is there's 3 elements that we're organisationally working around. The first element is you've got the local campaigns. You've got local campaigns before the election and after the election. Secondly, you've got the social the social community group space. In other words, the mutual aid areas, the food co-ops, the energy co-ops, the social nights, the scouts, the sports clubs, all this sort of stuff. And they're all doing charitable social stuff, which, is a major part of local social life. So it reanimates or animates these spaces. And of course, you've got the elections. Okay, so concretely, let's think about what's happening in Brixton. I'll just tell you what's happening again. This might not happen and da. But the exciting thing about this particular situation is it's not just me and one or two other people that read the literature. Brixton, one of the reasons we chose Brixton, if you know it, it's full of creatives. I think it's got more creatives than any other part of London per unit of the population. It's got a massively radical history, and there's a lot of people who've done a lot of reading about how you create like pro-social revolutions. So people have come out of the woodwork and they've said, look, what we want is to create an organisation, an association, let's call it, in Brixton that represents social Brixton, that's not part of capitalism, not part of business, that's not part of the political space, but is the social space fighting for the social space. And what that does is three things, right? It does community coordination, it brings people together, it organises things, it overcomes the collective action problem, it creates sociability, proximity dynamics, and people start doing more things because more things are happening. It does the elections, which we've just talked about, and then it creates a parallel assembly which is going to exist parallel to the Constitutional Assembly. In other words, there'll be Lambeth Council and then there'll be Lambeth Community Assembly, which will be the representation and the concretisation of the voice of the community. So, there's all this like liberal, campaign, warm words things where you go, we're here to promote the voice of the community, and, maybe it does a bit, but it doesn't really mean anything because there's no real power. What we're talking about here is a permanent, constituted, existent group of people who are continually influencing the council. All right, I'm going to talk about that, by the way, a little bit more. But the point I'm trying to make here is, number one, the election campaign is non-linear. Number two is it's situated in a self-organising social space. It's not just, we're just doing this little election things. And this is smart strategy, as we'll come on to in a minute, because it means the people that are elected aren't isolated when they're in there. And just as a little tangent, you might want to read about Bolivia if you're interested in this, which you should be, right? Because this is basically how you avoid sort of oligarchic degeneration. In other words, you can set up a cool political party, as we all know, and then over time, the people at the centre of it take control and everyone else is just running around, being told what to do, and it degenerates. A bit like the Labour Party at the moment. You've got a central core of people who are quite unpleasant, and all the members are leaving because they're not taken care of and no one really cares about them from the centre, and so they don't get people, going mobilising for them, and then they lose the election. Okay, so obviously I'm simplifying somewhat here, but broadly the Bolivian example, the left-wing party won the election, I think 4 times in a row, which is pretty unusual because you had all this mobilisation going on because the party belonged to the people. So again, there's lots of loose rhetoric, and we'll talk about this a bit more later on, but there's loose rhetoric about, your party belongs to the people, or the Green Party belongs to the people. It's like, yeah, okay, so that's a good intention, but what does it concretely mean? What it concretely needs to mean, and this is a central design point, is that the party has to be a function of the social space. In other words, the social comes first and it dominates the political instead of the other way around. So what this means in the Bolivian example is there were lots of community organisations and associations of shoemakers, so it was sectional organisation, or some of it was geographical, like the North Bolivia Farmers Group or whatever it is. And they wanted a political instrument basically to take control of the state. So they set up the political party as a reflection of their power. So they maintained control of who stood. They maintained control of the programme and then just used this political form. So this is the sort of major regime shift, like paradigm shift that needs to happen in order to combat the far right. And I'm not going to talk about it more now because I need to get on to the practicalities. But you can see there's more to this than, Roger's putting a few candidates up, right? Right, okay, but let's get back down to the practicalities. I'm going to talk to you about some of the numbers because, again, the numbers are important and they reflect the success of this strategy. In other words, like if the ratios were really crap, it's because the strategy's crap because it's not animating people. If the strategy animates people, then you get good ratios. In other words, more people turn up to give more money. So let's have a look at what actually happens. So what we know is if we put the first design is you put posters on lampposts along the streets, right? So there's 50 streets in a ward approximately. So you have 200 posters, 4 along each street. You've got 2 posters at the end of each street and on opposite sides of the roads. So in London, like 80% of people, for sake of argument, walk along the road every day because they get public transport, they don't get in their cars. So their eyes are going to see that poster. And we've done some experimentation with this, and arguably something like 50% of people actually know about what's going on. So you've got 50 streets, you're going to launch your candidate campaign, you put these 200 posters up. People already know your brand, they already know the idea because they've seen the poster and they've actually consciously thought, oh, there's a poster at the end of my street, what's that about? Oh, it says shake it up, which is what the campaign's going to be called, and let's put an independent councillor up for my ward. Oh, that sounds sort of interesting. So what we know and we estimate is like for every poster, one person turns up to the launch meeting. So, famous last words. But it seems like a fair bet because it's happened before. The second thing is if you knock on doors, you're knocking on doors, we know that, say, every 2 hours, one person will turn up to the launch meeting. Again, it might be more, it might be one. In the elections last year, 1 hour of promotion Labour produced one person in the launch meeting. So, but I'm being pessimistic, I'm saying half. So you've got, say, 20 people doing 2 hours each, that's 40 hours of door knocking, so 20 more people are going to come in. So let's say, for the sake of argument, the startup routine is going to be 100 people in the room from these 2 mobilisation mechanisms. Then you're going to sell this idea, promote this idea, or liberate them into the collectivity, the joyful collectivity of going to do door knocking as a big team. So my prediction is, and again, in the general election last year, 60% of people in the assemblies were going, yes, we'll go door knocking for this independent. But obviously they're not all going to show up and they're not all going to carry on. So for the sake of argument, like 20% of them. So then you're going to get like 20% of people, 20 people in the room regularly going to door knocking. So let's say 2 hours a week, which tends to be the industry average for a door knocker. So that's 40 hours, and 40 hours is then going to lead to more people coming to the next assembly, and that's going to lead to more door knockers being recruited. And you can have a look at the maths if you're interested. I think there might be a graphic about it. And I'm not going to go into micro detail. You can come to the Zoom call. But the upshot of it is you've got 20 door knockers. You can see within 2 or 3 meetings down the road, you're going to have your 40 door knockers. The 40 door knockers going out each week is 80 hours, right? 80 hours. And this is where it gets interesting, okay? Because in a ward in the UK, a ward is like a unit, of an electoral unit in local government. So there's usually about 10,000 people that can vote, okay? And the industry average, I don't know what it's like in other countries, but certainly people have said in the UK, if you knock on every door like 3 times, you're going to win that election. Obviously, you're not going to win it if you're mad. Obviously, you're not going to win it if you're the Labour Party because, Labour Party has gone down to 15% of the vote. They're the incumbent. But if you're a semi-decent alternative, and certainly if you're an independent, and you're saying, look, this is a local person on local issues, come to the assembly, you're pretty sure that 1 in 4, 1 in 3 people is going to vote. The upshot of it is you need to knock on those doors 3 times. So let's say, for the sake of argument, there's 10,000 people in the ward. That's 3,000 households, 3,000 doors. You've got to knock on the doors 3 times, so that's 9,000, okay? So the maths is as follows. You've got your 40 people door knocking, right? You've got 20 from your first meeting, you've gathered a few more. They're going to knock on 20 doors an hour. They're going to do 2 hours. That's 1,600 doors a week. So in 2 weeks, they're going to cover the whole ward, right? 3,200 doors. So in 6 weeks, they're going to do the whole ward 3 times. Okay, so in other words, you need a 6-week campaign period in order to win that ward. So you need 2 or 3 weeks before that. So you need a 10-week lead-up period. And this is doable, right? We've done the maths, right? We can get 100 people in the room, we can get the 40 door knockers, etc., etc. Okay, so I'll do a little bit more of the micro maths, as you might say. So there's also phoning. So you're knocking on the doors and you're saying, hey, you know, what's your opinion about what a candidate should stand for? What do you think about the area? Then you're saying, hey, you know, if you're interested, put your phone over the QR code. 5 people an hour, do that. That's our estimate based upon what we've done with our 3,000 door knocking experience. And then people are going to phone. They're going to make £8 an hour from the phoning all these people that are given the QR codes. And every 2 hours, you're going to talk to someone who goes, wow, this is amazing. It's what our community wants. I'll go out door knocking 2 hours a week for you. Okay, so you can see that, I'm not going to go through all the maths here, but you can see a non-linear process isn't developing. You've got more people coming into the meetings and you've got people phoning. That produces more door knockers. You're easily going to get your 40 door knockers for that ward. Obviously, some people are going to drop out, but you've got all these other people coming in. And then, of course, there's the money. I'm not going to go into the money in great depth, but if you go and do the maths on it, and again, you can come to the Zoom calls to find out about it, but you've got people giving money in the meetings. About 25% of people will give £10 a month, let's say, in the meetings. And then you've got people on the phones. You're doing 20, 30 hours of phoning. Every hour you're making like £5, £10. You put that through an exponential feedback system, and with all the different wards, you're making something like £25,000 a month by the end of the campaign with 20, 25 wards. Okay, now the interesting thing here is, again, usually when you do a campaign, you're going, hey, give us some money for the campaign. That's not the framing here. What you're seeding or promoting, in so much as you can promote it rather than just seed it, is you're saying, we are creating an organisation for Lambeth, right? A Lambeth organisation for the people of Lambeth that reflects the people of Lambeth and promotes their interests, as opposed to conventional parties that follow the neoliberal corporate agenda because they're corrupt or, you know, ideologically incapable of supporting people and all the rest of it. So what you're saying to people then is, look, this is going to carry on after the election, right? This is a social organisation. The election is a function of our desire to control Lambeth, right? It's not about what we're about. What we're about is the whole picture. In other words, then people will give you money once a month, or at least that's the hypothesis. So the election is the thing that propels people's enthusiasm. All these door knockers are going to carry on and be enthusiastic in social organisation afterwards. And you're producing this stream of money which is coming on so that you can pay people full time, because, as we've discussed, unless you have people working full time, and obviously it's dangerous, then with this, then you can't build up a volunteer base in any massive way. So you might say, well, Roger, you know, these ratios are really ambitious. We did this in our locality. No one turned up to the meeting. No one wanted to give any money. Okay, why does it work? Number one, the situation is changing, as we've discussed, by the month, but definitely by the year, the level of social repression. In other words, people are more and more pissed off. The reason they're not mobilising is because of the collective action problem, right? We've talked about this. So that's like the structural context. The second thing is you're releasing that social energy through giving people agency. And there's 2 key elements how you give people agency. And by agency, I don't mean performative, we love you, we're listening to you and all that rubbish, right? Actual concrete, credible, cynicism busting agency. What you're saying to local communities, you choose the candidate, right? So you're knocking on the door and say, do you know someone who's really cool in your area? Remember, this is a 50 street area, right? People know each other. It's a local neighbourhood sort of level. And you say, people will go, oh, you know, I know Mrs. Jones. She does loads of community work. She's great. She's in her late 50s. You know, she's got grandchildren, but she works really hard. You know, you've got the local hero sort of situation. So what happens is, obviously, there's different ways to micro-design this. You say, if you can get 20 nominations for Mrs. Jones, then she can stand in an open primary or an open hustings to become the candidate. So let's say, for the sake of argument, 10 or 20 people emerge from this process. And arguably, just the top 10 ones that got the most nominations go forward to the primary. So what the primary and the hustings, these are peculiar words, right? But all it means is you have a big public meeting in a church hall or something in the ward. Only people from the ward can vote, obviously. Maybe you have to check their addresses or something. And they come in and you have, you know, it's a social occasion. You have kids running around, you have food, all this sort of thing. And then you have hustings. In other words, the candidates speak for 5 minutes, let's say. They have 2 people promoting them. You know, they have a bit of factual information. You vote for the 3 that you like. Gets down to 2 people, and then the 2 people have 15 minutes to talk, let's say, and there's more witnesses saying they're great people, and then you vote, you choose your candidate, everyone claps, right? So number one, this is democratic. This is what real democracy is. This is not like a self-selecting group of ideologically committed people joining a political party that then decides a candidate and enters into the social space, the neighbourhood, in a transactional relationship of going, this is our person, they will give you this. It's more like, this person is one of us who comes through us, actualised through the assembly hustings process, and therefore they're more credible, right? So this is ethically and politically attractive. And for that very reason, it's strategically like a genius move. The reason it's a genius move is because all those people that have actively participated in that proximity and sociability are 10 times more likely to go out door knocking for you because they've chosen you, right? They haven't been offered that person like some supermarket offer. I mean, there's no really, you don't go out promoting your supermarket, do you? You know, just because they've offered you an apple. All right, so that's the one thing. Secondly, you're going to give them more money because it's your candidate, right? So you can see how this builds the momentum. And the second thing is you choose the programme. This is a little bit complicated, but it can broadly go as follows, which is you take like data off people on the doorstep. What's your 3 top issues? You aggregate those. You do a presentation in an assembly for all the ward, and then people just from that ward discuss what their priorities are. And then they come up with the big priorities. You know, we want a better park, we want more housing, we want this, right? And then that basically becomes the programme for the candidate. So the candidate, by the way, has to sign like a public declaration that they're going to follow the desires of people in the ward, right? So there's a number of problems with this. Like number one, maybe they're all fascists and you're going to come up with a far-right agenda. Well, maybe in certain areas of the country, and I'm not going to deal with that issue in this video, otherwise I'll be here for 5 hours. But in most of the country, you know, you're going to come up with some pro-social option because most people are pro-social, particularly once they've discussed issues and they realise that the pro-social orientation makes sense, you know, for their lives and their interests. Obviously, if you're coming up with demands, right, you're going to then have to work out how they're going to actually be enacted. Like, what are the policies? How do you actually get the money? All this sort of thing. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit further on, I think. But that's something that needs to get sorted out. And also, then there's, well, what about all the other wards? So you have to have an aggregation process. So you've got all the wards. They're going to be broadly the same thing. Some things are going to be specific to that ward, which is fine. But if you're looking at the whole area, like the Lambeth area, for instance, in this case, then there will have to be an assembly and everyone
the whole thing gets aggregated, and then ideally you've got the thing that emerged in New York in the mayoral campaign, where there was basically 5 key demands or key propositions. So it's cognitively simple. So the point here is having bottom-up democratic processes does not mean you have a chaos of programs and orientations. You can design it so that you aggregate things by getting people to prioritize in the assembly. So to summarize then, you've got your candidate chosen and you've got your program chosen, and this is democratically attractive, but it's what produces those ratios, and it's those ratios that are going to get you to win. Obviously, it's not just you versus the bad guys. You're putting your candidates up, but in the UK context, there's other radical independents, there's the Green Party, and there's your party, or various left groupings, right? And in so much as they're all broadly have the same orientation, that we need to do something about capitalism, which is the main issue, and tax the rich and all the rest of it, then you're not going to win if they're all battling against each other. So there's 3 scenarios about how you aggregate so that you can maximize your social power. So the first thing is look, there's a ward, there's 3 Green councillors, like in Brixton. We want to put someone up as a candidate, and so we've got 4 candidates for 3 representatives from that ward. Okay, so that's not ideal, but it doesn't mean you have to be at each other's throats. So you can have what you might call friendly competition. So you're knocking on the doors and you're going, look, we want you to vote for the independent, but you should also use your other 2 votes for the Green Party because we're broadly the same. And the Green Party are going, look, we've got our 3 people, but if you don't want to vote for us, vote for the independent because they're broadly the same. So it's not ideal, but it's better than having some big sectarian, ding-dong, as you might say. Okay, the next thing is you have an open primary. In other words, you have, let's say, a Your Party person and an independent and 2 Green people, and there's 4 of them, and there's two representatives of that ward, and you have an open hustings, it's an open primary idea where people are asked questions and they go, okay, so, what's your deal? What's your background? How supportive are you of this community? How long you've lived here? All this sort of thing. And you have a vote, and the 2 people who get the most votes basically represent the radical proposition for that ward. And the other 2 guys gracefully step down because everyone's knows there's no point having 4 candidates in a 2-person ward. Okay, so that's the open primary idea. And then the third idea is basically you decide beforehand, which is arguably what we're hoping will happen in Brixton. So we'll say, the Green Party will say, oh, right, well, these are our target wards. We're really keen to put all the candidates up for these. We think we can win them within our resources, and so we don't want to stand there. So arguably around the edges, 1 or 2 independents might stand if they've got connections with that community, in which case, hopefully the Green Party will gracefully stand down one of their candidates. Okay, so that's one area. Then you've got a second area where the Green Party can't really win or is unlikely to win. So then you have 2 Green candidates and 1 independent, or 2 independents, 1 Green candidate. And the beauty of this, which is another reason why, arguably you're going to wipe Labour out in Lambeth, is you've got 2 teams. So you've got 1 team knocking on the door of Green Party going, hey, we're the Green Party. We think the Greens are great. Vote for our two candidates. Oh, and also vote for the independent because they basically support broadly the same programme. And then the independent team is going around knocking on the doors going, hey, we've got our independent person. They've got they've been chosen from the community. They're really cool. But use your other 2 votes to vote for the Greens because they're broadly the same as us. You see how that works, right? So these are 3 things which need to evolve, right, on the left in order to do what 30, 40, 50% of the population want, which is the left to be united in a certain electoral sense. So the beauty of this is you can keep your own identity. It's not a one hegemonic, dominating old left force that everyone has to submit to, like the old Communist Party. No, no, no. What we're doing is we're doing what I call close ecology. You've got lots of different elements in the ward, in the social space, but when the election comes along, they all work together, but they maintain their autonomy, which is broadly what happens in the Bolivian model, right? You've got the autonomous community organisations. No one's like collapsing in. No one, there's this sort of general trend in the UK at the moment that everyone's joining the Green Party. No, 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 that's not what should happen. What should happen is there should be like 4 or 5 different formations, social, political formations, movement parties. And when it comes to the election, they use like whoever's got the most momentum and the best candidates basically to stand for that ward or that constituency. Obviously, if you're doing proportional representation, this doesn't matter so much. It depends where you're at. And the last sort of fun fact, as it were, which a Green councillor friend told me, who supports all of this, he said, well, the other thing, obviously, is if you get 400 people in the ward, right, to come to a meeting to choose the candidates, you're going to get their data, a telephone number, their email. So you've already got those people to contact and get to do the door knocking and all the rest of it. Okay, so you can see how this is building up, right? It's not just, it's not just a few wards. It's not just doing all the wards and not really knowing how you're going to do it. It's doing the petition, it's doing the door knocking, doing the phoning. You've got your ratios because it's a bottom-up movement. You're building your alliances. It's all starting to look quite exciting, isn't it? Right? So let's just look at how powerful this could be. So next section could turn out to be quite embarrassing because, I'm going to look at the Brixton Lambeth scenario and show what the outcomes could look like. And the outcomes could be very dramatic. So I think this is probably a generalisation you can make around most Western cities at the present time, which is the majority of the electorate doesn't vote. So in Lambeth, 70% of people don't vote. Why is that happening? Because of the general alienation that local government doesn't have control over the areas where people want control, so why do it? Or the parties that get in bullshit because they know they can't do anything real, and then people become disillusioned with politics generally, which is, of course, one of the reasons why they'll go into the fantasy land of the far right, because it's far better to be in a fantasy land than having to deal with the endless humiliation of not getting your core democratic demands sorted, basic income, housing, all this sort of stuff. Let's think about this. In Lambeth, 70% of people aren't voting. So in a ward, most wards are, say, 10,000 people. So 7,000 people aren't voting. Then you look at what the Labour vote is. So the Labour vote, and again, we can generalise this, maybe it's the same in Lyon or whatever, is the Labour Party is getting around 1,500 votes, right? Sometimes 2,000, sometimes only 1,000. So it's only 1.5 people out of 10 are voting Labour. 15% of the ward is voting Labour. So you can see what I'm coming onto here. When you've got going out door knocking and you're knocking on the doors and all the rest of it, and you're doing your assemblies and you're doing your phoning, basically you only need to find 1.5 people out of 10 to vote for you to win that ward. 15% of the ward to vote out the Labour councillor. So suddenly it becomes super exciting, right? It's like it's a house of cards. It's an emperor without clothes. So in Lambeth, the Labour Party has got, I think it's 60 councillors, but someone told me the other day it's 58 or 56. Anyway, but there's only 64, 65 seats. So for the sake of argument, they've got 55 councillors, and then there's 5 or 10 other councillors, a few Greens, a few Liberal Democrats, this sort of thing. So when you look at it like that, it's like, this is a Labour-dominated area. Everyone loves Labour. Labour get in. They're a massive party. They've got massive support. If you look under the cover, suddenly it's rubbish, right? They've only got 15% support in each ward. So you can easily win that ward, and you've got all this momentum with your 40 door knockers and your phoning and, your posters and all the rest of it. So the whole thing starts looking very interesting, particularly if the icing on the cake is you're working with the Green Party or your party or whatever it is, and you're just not competing with each other apart from in 1 or 2 places. In other words, you've got these two teams going about. So again, we're piling on all these things, and the upshot of it is you can set up those 20 campaigns, you can work with the Green Party, and you can basically wipe out the Labour Party. No disrespect to any Labour voters watching this, or councillors for that matter, right? It's democracy, relax. Okay, you see how this works, because it's easy, you gain this momentum. So if you think this is slightly mad, there are like 2 case studies of this happening in the UK, like with Frome Council in the southwest. They had, don't quote me on this, but it's something like they had 6 months to 4 months to basically get their act together. They put candidates up in all the wards and they won on the first election, or I think it might be in the second election, where they took control of the council. In North Devon, a friend of mine did it, and in 6 months they took control of the council. There's an example of the Madrid election in 2016. In four weeks before the election, the left hadn't got a candidate. They had selected this woman, 2% name recognition. In 4 weeks, they animated the community, pushing out, creating autonomy around Madrid, and they won. Wow, right? Why is this happening? Because of non-linear dynamics. In other words, like, this whole thing gets exciting, draws more people in, which becomes more exciting, which becomes more exciting. And the reason it's exciting is from the day one, you're not saying, oh, we're just putting up 4 councillors in Lambeth because we're a bit upset with the council. No. Nor are we saying, hey, if we all work together, we could maybe get a majority. No, what we're saying is we're going to wipe them out. We are going to remove every Labour councillor from power because we can. And we should, because they've been rubbish. Yes, they've done some good stuff, but overall, it's fair to say that the people of Lambeth have had enough, right, of the Labour Party. Been there since 1920 or whatever it is. Maybe they should go and have a holiday. So don't need to be unpleasant about it. It's just democracy, right? It's democracy in action. You've got a party which people don't like. The only reason they're in is because of the collective action problem, which is everyone else isn't coordinated and isn't organised to go and basically get that win. All right, so what's a little bit of icing on the cake here? What we've talked about so far is the assembly methodology, the door knocking, the phoning. Then we've added on the alliance with the Green Party or your party or whatever it is. Then we've also got like 3 other things, right? We've got the framing. The framing is not them. In other words, you're knocking on the door. You're not going, oh, I'm from X party. You're going, we're not from a political party. What we're from is an association of people in this ward who put up our own candidate. We're not them. So if you look around the country, this is why independents win, because they're not them. That's the framing, right? In other words, you're sexy, you're new. This is different. Maybe you won't be different one day, but at this moment in time, at the end of 2025, you are. All right, so what else have you got going for you? You've got the social media. So in Madrid, you've got all these young people putting stuff on social media. So you give it to all the kids, right? 16-year-olds, 18-year-olds, whatever it is. They go and create the memes, do the TikTok, and it all starts rolling because of that. And lastly, you've got the organisational outreach. So in Lambeth, we've got a bunch of community organisations. We're all going to be meeting soon. And all these organisations are threatened by the council because of the cuts. Arguably, they've got nothing to lose. Also, it's a democratic project. It's what they believe in. So what are they going to do? They're going to put it on their social media that they support the independents. They're going to send out, stuff on email, this sort of thing. They're going to hold meetings in support of it. They're going to give money, potentially, to the independent candidates. And last but not least, they're going to create spaces, right? So XXX Church, he thinks that, the community needs to get together. They allow a meeting of this big social entity in their church. You don't have to pay like £1,000 an hour or whatever for a big space. All right, let's look at the broader project, and then we'll start to return to strategy and the big picture. So I've talked to a bunch of people about this. This isn't like necessarily new. It's just that the ratios are so good. There could be a major political structural rupture in British politics, right? But what the people have said, and these aren't just cynical people, never do anything. The cool people who already done it they said, okay, Roger, this is the issue. You get all these councillors in, great. But with all due respect to the councillors, these are ordinary people, which is cool, but they don't know They don't know what to do. They don't know how local government works. They don't know about all the sort of semi-corrupt, this is the way we've done it since, 1350 type things, this medieval ambience of local government. So what you need is you can't have all these people being selected and just ambling into the council, having wiped out Labour. They all need training, and they need to be structurally committed to doing it. In other words, you don't become a shake it up like independent unless you commit to 2 weekends of intense training on how local government works, how you deal with the bureaucracy, how you deal with all the corruption and double dealing and all that crap, and what actually you can do in order to use the social space to recreate itself so that it doesn't need to depend upon the big bankers and the big developers. In other words, you're developing a political social programme. Okay, so that needs to happen. Secondly, the parallel assembly needs to be organised. So in Lambeth, there's 60 councillors, so there's 25 wards. Most councillors have got, most wards, as I've said, have got 3 councillors or 2. So what we do with the parallel council is we do the same thing selected by sortition. So if there's 3 councillors in a ward, we select 3 people through sortition from that ward. So the last video I did, lots of people put in the comments what's sortition. So just bear with me if you know what it is. I'm just going to explain it briefly. So what you do is you go into the ward and you select people randomly. So every person in that ward has got equal chance of being chosen. So then there's the practicality of doing it. So one way of doing it is you've got 50 roads in the ward, you put every road on a piece of paper, you pick them out of a hat, maybe you can do it on a computer, and you go, right, those are the 5 wards. You knock on all those doors and you get you talk to 300 people and 10 of them say, yes, I'll do this, because obviously there's a bit of commitment. And incidentally, obviously people are going to need some financial compensation. Otherwise you're going to get middle class people doing it. Okay, so then you've got those 10 people, and you've got 10 people in each of the wards. You've got to narrow it down to 3. So then you use demographical analysis to say, okay, a certain number of people obviously need a gender balance, you need an income balance reflective of the ward or of Lambeth as a whole, and you've got racial background, cultural backgrounds sort of issues as well. So no one's pretending this is sort of, in some absolutist sense, like a reflection, but it's substantially a reflection. And the main point about it, of course, is that it gives the working class, the poor, the marginalised, the migrant people in those wards a voice. And this is the critical revolutionary element to it. The parallel assembly will not only represent Lambeth, it will look like Lambeth, right? Or whichever area you're doing in it. In other words, it'll have immediate credibility and legitimacy. But then there's the question that these people as well, of course, need to know what they're talking about. So then if they're paralleling the council, they will go in and study the council and all this sort of thing and sit on committees. And also they will have citizens' assemblies. These are assemblies where you have maybe 50 of them or 40 of them or something, and they will look at housing, and they get a plurality of inputs. They get experts, they get interest groups, and they get frontline people. And through that, they develop a strategy which is well-grounded. There's a big literature on this. I'm sure many of you know about it, and it's cool. Basically comes up with pro-social, sort of rational policy, which is efficient and all the rest of it. Now, a little add-on, you can come to the Zoom calls to hear about it. Sexy add-on is what I call the World Cup model. So you've got all these people in the parallel assembly in Lambeth or, North New York or wherever it's going to be, and they're having an assembly on something. And obviously, everyday people are not going to turn up. Maybe some of them are. But why don't you have it so that the whole borough or area can basically participate? So you film it live, and then when people get in at night, how the World Cup works, as you know, is people watch the match, but they only watch the UK. They're not going to watch, a team from another country that they're not interested in. In other words, most people, maybe people are just interested in housing. They're only going to watch the whole session on housing, but they're not going to watch the whole session on drugs because that's not their thing, or they haven't got the time. But they may be interested in drugs. In other words, they watch the highlights. So when you're watching the World Cup, you either watch the whole match, don't you, or you watch the highlights. So you watch the highlights. So then every day you get like a 20-minute video and you get the highlights of people getting emotional about various issues and, you know, those seminal moments where people and witnesses and the discussions change. And then all those people can get on their social media and basically vote. So they don't necessarily have a statutory power to influence, but basically the Citizens' Assembly is getting continuous feedback from the community. It's like, oh, we suggested we have a voluntary tax of 5% on the richest 5% people in the borough. Oh, is this any good? You know, 90% of people put on their social media, fantastic idea. So then it encourages them to basically do what the people of Lambeth broadly want to see happen. Okay, so that's a broader sort of part of the ecology. Then you've got the borough organisation. So maybe this big conglomerate of social connectivity actualises itself through maybe splitting the borough into 4 areas, having monthly meetings, having ways in which people can link up, find out what different organisations are doing, synergising between them, showing social solidarity, maybe setting up a community bank, all this sort of thing, the food co-op, the energy co-op, we've talked about all that sort of thing, having a training infrastructure, which we're going to talk about next, having a FIC, a self-perpetuating and self-reinforcing and positive feedback mechanism within the social space. This connects, of course, with the mutual aid, you know, because the fact of the matter is the neoliberal system is not going to have the money to basically pay for everyone to get what they want. I mean, sure, we're going to tax the rich, but in the short term or even in the long term, what we want is more social connectivity. So you don't need to professionalise all the social functions. You know, people check in on each other, people have a food co-op at the end of the street, all this sort of stuff. So the first thing to say is this could be rubbish, right? Nobody in Brixton's interested, you know, back to the drawing board. Failure is good. It will show us what we're not doing right, and maybe we'll go and do it in Birmingham next year. But you can see the direction of travel. But I honestly think there's a substantive, non-trivial chance, as they say, that Labour could lose all its councillors or except, you know, an outlier of 4 who are the decent guys who people vote for because they're decent guys. The reason why this rapid mobilisation model works is that suddenly you get this big surge of rupture in the social space, right? You know, Labour's been there since 1920 or whatever, and suddenly they've lost everything. This creates media. In other words, like you get a sort of meta non-linearity in the broader social space. In other words, in the UK and internationally. So the big case study here is New York, isn't it? Right? You know, there was a mayoral campaign. The guy who won, he's amazing. No one thought he would win. He had 2% name recognition, you know, a year before, something like that. But what did they do? You know, I'm going to talk about the organisation here, which people don't tend to. I mean, obviously the guy's got great charisma, but that's not the real story. The real story, or at least a substantial part of the story, is the organisation, the 50,000 door knockers, the social media saying it's cool to go door knocking, the creation of the programme. So all this builds up, and suddenly, like, it's a global news story. There's 10,000 people all around the States going, hang on a minute, if he can do it, I can do it, I'm going to stand, right? So looking at the UK example, what we've got then is some major shakes of the dice. The first shake of the dice is, wow, this is great. So everyone starts using this methodology, and in 2027 local elections, we start wiping the board because we're using a methodology the other political parties can't replicate because they're all top down, right? That's number one. Number two, we basically have a demonstration effect about how the left comes together. In other words, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have open hustings. You know, if someone comes in and they've got 20 door knockers, i.e. they're substantive, then they get in the hustings and we decide together as a community who the left candidates will be, whether it's Green, Independent, your party or whatever, right? And the third scenario is the Labour Party collapses because the Labour Party, you know, hopefully I'm not being too unkind, is full of people who are primarily concerned about power. And if power isn't in the ballpark, then why should you be in there? So you either get like a collapsing in toxicity like what we got in the Tories for the last 14 years, because they're a power party as well, or you get people leaving because what's the point, right? They're not going to get in. That leads to what a lot of smart people think will be a general election in 2027, 2 years early, because Labour's on 15% of the vote, 17%, whatever it is. Once your party gets going, once this gets going, maybe it's going to fall more. And so everyone knows, I don't know if you know about British politics, well, some of you will, if you're on 10, 15% of the vote, you're going to get 5 MPs to 50 MPs. Once you get to 25% of the vote, you're going to get 300 MPs plus, right? Because you've got this 5-party system and you've got the single constituencies. In other words, the project here is to bring the left together, number one. And number two is to use this methodology and this framing to basically get to 25% of the vote. So you've got the Zach Polanski sort of bounce, which gets you to 15, 16, 17%. But then to get to 25 and basically win the election, from reform, you're going to have a coalition and you're going to have sexy local organisation, which is what is my patch, humbly speaking. Okay, so you can see why when, I talk to people in the next few weeks and go, hey, can you do 2 hours of door knocking? It's not like 2 hours of door knocking, for some little pincy little project, which is cool, but doesn't mean anything. We have here a grand strategy which is going to basically transform British politics. And if it doesn't, fine. But it's a possibility, right? Because we thought it through, and we're promoting it, and you've got this self-fulfilling dynamic going on. So what I'm hoping is, through watching this video, you're getting a big dose of how this mobilisation is going to work and how you're going to rupture the political space and create that non-linear potentiality for top-level social change. But around it, you're getting some of the supportive structures, such as organisation, culture and training. So I'm going to go through a few general principles. Again, I've talked about this in other places, and obviously other people have. But I am going to give you a few concrete, tick boxes, which I think are things which are well established or sufficiently established to be something that should be on your tick list of things that need to happen. So I'll start with difficult people. So one of the biggest problems, and arguably the biggest problem with social movements and social spaces, is that people come in who are a problem in the sense that they may be abusive, so that's like a moral problem, or they may just be disruptive, but that's like an organisational problem. So it becomes an organisational problem in the sense that if people aren't challenged or asked to leave, then they basically lead to other people leaving. Largely because of a collective action problem at a micro level. You've probably been in groups where someone's being a bit of an arse and it just gets really boring, and one evening you go, you know what, I'm not going to go. It's just like, that guy's just a little bit odd, I can't really cope. And then that triggers someone else going, this group's getting fairly small. There's these two guys who are just a bit weird. They're not really including us, and then they don't go. So this is what I call 6 Marxists in a pub in Hackney problem, which is a bit politically problematic to say so. So it's nothing against Hackney, it's nothing against Marxists, it seriously isn't. But it's a phenomenon, right? Which is you get movements and basically you end up with this hardcore group of people that either are very ideologically orientated, quite unpleasant, or just don't have social skills, let's put it bluntly, or all three. So in order to stop that dynamic from happening, which is probably the major dynamic in pro-social left spaces, there has to be an opposite mechanism. And the opposite mechanism is to be clear at the beginning that if people engage in behaviours A, B, C, D, then they will be warned and then they'll be asked to leave. And then critically, someone has the responsibility to ask them, and they know they have that responsibility. So you concentrate that responsibility in one person, so you don't have the diffusion of responsibilities, so no one wants to engage in the cost of challenging someone. That's right, the bystander effect. All right, so this is a matter of design. So the top of the organisation has to have a top. There has to be a top to it. And this is a major innovation moving away from horizontalism. You know, the old idea, you just have loads of groups and they somehow miraculously make decisions. Decisions aren't miraculously made. They are made by people with addresses, as they say, right? They are real people and they make decisions. And again, I'm not going to go into the depths of the literature, but in terms of your tick box, you need to be starting off with your 8 people in a core group who are basically going to run the organisation. At some point, they need to step down, there needs to be training, there needs to be sortition councils and various other things I haven't got time to go on about. But in terms of getting this thing on the go on Lyon or, you know, Atlanta or wherever it's going to be, this is how it starts. It doesn't start by having great big meetings where everyone's talking about things. It's like 4 or 5 people in the room, a 3-hour session, you sleep on it, another 3-hour session, and then you go out and you start. And then you have other sessions, as we've discussed, right, in order to take feedback and pivot and work out what goes on. It's fast and furious. And it's run by these people. And the reason why it has to be run by these people is so they have the credibility and the ownership and the responsibility to basically say to the different working groups, you're the coordinator, I expect you to ask someone to leave if they're being abusive, weird or disruptive. And obviously it can be done in a nice way and it's clear and there's pieces of paper, and when you join the organisation you get that piece of paper, right? Okay, so this is like critical. The whole thing's going to collapse in a heap unless you do this, which is why I'm talking about organisation in this video, because you can go away and get all those great ratios and then it's going to collapse because there's someone being disruptive in Ward X and they're not being asked to leave, or, you know, go and do something, you know, that doesn't involve talking to people in meetings. All right, so another sort of reinforcement here is having induction. So it amazes me how many organisations you just join and you don't actually find out what's going on. And that doesn't mean just the technocratic stuff. It doesn't mean, okay, this is how we're organised. You know, these are the working groups. These are the guys in the core group. It basically means what's your values, and it has to be 50% participatory. In other words, 50% of the time they need to be talking, not you, the people who are being inducted, because if they're going to own it, they need to participate in it, and arguably they create their own group agreements so that they own those agreements. Okay, what sort of environment do you want to work in? What's your 5 key points? Okay, so we don't want people being sexist, racist and crap like that. Okay, we want people to turn up on time. Okay, we want people to do the work, and, you know, okay, when there's conflicts, we don't want people shouting, this sort of thing, right? So you've got concrete behavioural stuff. So it's not just warm words. It's not just, hey, this organisation's great. It's like, if you want to join this organisation, this is what you have to do, you know, A, B, C, D. It's in the induction. You've got it. You've got the induction. Bomb. You join the organisation. If you don't like it, that's cool. You know, maybe there's better organisations somewhere else. Okay, then you've got meeting culture. Meeting culture is absolutely vital to build like a large social space, you know, movement, organisation. What meeting culture means primarily is it a shit show or not? What does that mean? What it means is it has to start on time, right? Not religiously, you know, but it has to start within 10 minutes of the start, okay? It has to finish on time. Again, not religiously, it can go 10 minutes over, but it shouldn't be going an hour over. You'd be surprised, or maybe you're not surprised. So many movements, political groups, people arrive late, people finish late. This is fine if you're an ideologue, if you're a purist, if you're like, this is your life. But Mrs. Jones needs to know that she can get back 9 o'clock to look after her kids, right? If she has to leave early, basically she's going to feel pretty like alienated because she can't participate in the rest of the meeting. There's nothing cool, participatory or progressive about shit meetings. It's basically like a form of exploitation, to put it bluntly, to have people come into meetings and treat them badly in that meeting. Secondly, you have to have good facilitation. Facilitation means not just keeping stack, not just going, you talk, you talk, you talk. What it means is the facilitator is engaging with people to bring them into a decision, because otherwise you're going to be there for like, you know, 5 hours. In other words, so that's a good point, Joe. What do you think, Jack? Okay, so your idea, Jack, is similar to Joe's. Maybe this is a way in which we can come to a decision, if you see what I mean. So they're proactively biased towards getting a decision made. Secondly, obviously, or not obviously, maybe, if it's a really tricky issue, you delegate out of the system, out of the meeting, and people come down back next week. In other words, the meeting should not be more than an hour. Like 90% of meetings should be an hour or an hour and a half max. Sure, if you're having a big weekend, get together, sort out strategy, fine. But you shouldn't be having 5 weekends, right? You should have 2 weekends max. You know, Martin Luther King and all those guys, they had 1 weekend, they designed it, they made the decision. Why was that? Because they were cool, right? They knew they had to get on with the job. They don't have the luxury of messing about for 6 months and then grinding to a halt because everyone's bored, or half the people have left because, you know, they've got better things to do with their time. Next thing, training. So while I was in prison, I wrote this book about landless peasants or rural workers in Brazil. I've forgotten the name of it, do apologise. Anyway, so millions of people joined this movement. They went and occupied, you know, big landlord estates where the landlord wasn't doing anything, and they basically had a right, according to the constitution, to take the land because it wasn't being used. You know, it went for 20, 30 years, millions of people got shot, it's big drama, but it enabled millions of people to get land. It was massively successful. So what you're going to think is, wow, that's great, you know, get the land. No, right? This organisation was a training organisation. The occupation of the land was the cherry on the cake. Cherry on the cake, is that right? Icing on the cake. Anyway, you know what I'm saying, right? The interesting thing when you read the 300-page book is it's all about training. Why is it all about training? Because you're going into these poorest areas of Brazil in 1970. You know, there's no point idealising the poor. You know, many of them are on drugs, many of them are alcoholics, there's massive domestic abuse. They have really hard lives. You need to organise these people. How do you organise them? Through training. You say, right, okay, come on Sunday, you're going to get an introduction to this movement. Okay, then you're going to headhunt people that are potentially going to be leaders. Then you're going to send people off for like a 2-week course. And it's amazing. It's like a university. You have these like 3-month, 6-month courses. This is the direction of travel, because you don't create solidity without training. And obviously the training needs to be cool, it needs to be participatory, it needs to be practical. It can't just be talking about academic stuff, but it needs to be theoretical as well. I haven't got time to go into all of that. Obviously, there's people around the world who are experts in it. They need to be brought in, but it needs to be like bottom up as well as top down, right? Enabling people, like Paulo Freire said, to actually engage in those trainings so they bring their own experience and they can co-create their own realities and obviously learn from people that know about the subject as well. Which leads us on to like the last thing really, which is leadership. So I was in a meeting the other day and people were going, oh, you know, people won't do that. So this sort of phrase comes up, you know, this can't happen. This phrase comes up a lot from the slow lobby in the movement, right? They'll say, yeah, you can't ask people to do that. What they mean is they don't want you to, right? So what leadership means is asking the impossible. So you can put that on your fridge, right? Leadership means asking the impossible in the sense of the impossible, which is a social construction. In other words, people can't go out more than 2 hours a day door knocking. I think they can. They can do 5 hours. Obviously, they can't do 10. They'll be knackered, right? So leadership isn't about asking the real impossible. We're not asking people to do 100 hours a week or something stupid like that. What the leader does is goes, we're going to do this anyway. We're going to put 20 candidates up in our local election, even though we only have the resources for 5. How are we going to do that? We're just going to make it happen, guys. Okay, so this happens all in the movies all the time. You know, it's no big deal. It happens all the time in history. Where it doesn't happen is in left movements because they're all left defeatists and they think you can't ask people to go the extra mile. Yes, you can. And people are more enthusiastic when they go the extra mile because they believe they're going the extra mile to make something exciting. And because it's exciting, they cheer up. In other words, this is a self-fulfilling system. If you have a system where people aren't expected to do amazing things, they won't do amazing things and they get cynical. If you have a self-fulfilling positive feedback loop, you're saying, guys, we are going to take control of Lambeth Council. We are going to do it. It doesn't mean we are going to do it, right? in a sort of literal sense. It means you're creating a vision and an excitement and a possibility simply by saying we're going to do it. Again, it has to be obviously backed up with a plan, which is ambitious and all the rest of it. It's not just like, good luck, guys, see you in 3 months. Which brings us on to the second element of leadership, which is you have to walk the talk, right? So many people, particularly academics, no disrespect to academics, but, say, oh, we need all this great stuff. But are they door knocking? Are they doing the petitions? Are they, giving up their jobs, getting challenged? Are they going to prison? No, of course they're not, right? And this is the problem we've got, is we don't have classical leadership. Martin Luther King was the first guy over the bridge. He was the first guy to get shot. This is what leaders were before 1989, and they all started retreating behind desks and doing policy papers, right? Leaders would actually go out and do the business. I had a famous interview with Aaron Bastiani, is he called? Anyway, in Navarra, I was challenging about this, and I said, why don't you lead a march? Because you're a leader of your generation. And he said, I don't think that's wise. Probably didn't mean to say that, just came out. But that was his default cultural position, because during the neoliberal period, leadership, being cool, being a media figure, basically means all you do is media. Right? No, we need Zach Polanski to sit in Parliament Square and be arrested, and then everyone will love him because they know he's the real deal. And the radical right does this all the time. There's a guy called Tommy Robinson, in the UK, he's been in prison. That's one of the reasons he gets 100,000 people out to support him. And all the left are going, ooh, how did that happen? It's because the guy's got guts. Yeah, the guy's a fascist and he's got guts, right? So this is what needs to happen on the left. Like, I've got credibility in Brixton, not because I came in and did an academic lecture, about all of this. I've got credibility because I basically worked my bollocks off for 3 months, door knocking and petitioning, and I'm there every day, rain or shine, because number one, that's the only way you're going to get it going, and number two, it's an integrity issue, right? If you're not actually doing the work, then why should anyone else do the work? And no, I'm not running off with loads of money, just in case you were thinking so, because there's not lots of money anyway. Okay, so you get the idea. If you're sitting there going, okay, we want to start it in Lyon, we want to start it, in Barcelona. Obviously, there's cool stuff happening in Lyon and Barcelona, so this is just like a contribution to your design. But these are the key the structural support issues which you need to think about in terms of, organisation, culture, and training and leadership. So let me say a last thing before I get onto the sort of the end game stuff, which is, look, I've said this on lots of other occasions, but it needs to be on your checklist. What you're trying to do here in terms of create a mass mobilisation is push through to what you might call cool, ordinary people. So there's 3 groups. There's like the gatekeepers. These are all the people that are trying to stop you within the existing movement space from getting things on. And then there's like the mass of the general public who are never going to mobilise because they never did, never will, because they're just ordinary people and they just go with the flow. And there's about 5% of the population, for the sake of argument, who are people who are alienated from the political space because it's so alienating, crap meetings, weirdos and weird egos and all this sort of stuff, right? But they would if something cool came along. So I'll give you 1 or 2 examples of this, right? Like there's a book. There was a book written about the Bernie Sanders thing. I've forgotten. It will be in the information below. So there's 2 chapters on that, right? There's a chapter about nurses. Nurses are great. Why? Because they have this existential groundedness because they have to deal with death and suffering all the time, which sort of focuses your character building. Let's put it like that. So in other words, like you're trying to get people to come in who have had life experience of why life is shit, which is why you need lower middle class, working class people in the movement rather than just people who do, thinking work and haven't experienced anything too bad. So that's one thing. Second thing is you need people who know how to do stuff. So again, in this book about the Bernie Sanders campaign, it was quite funny because they were saying, quite honestly, that the political people, no disrespect, don't actually know how to organise. And this is a bad phenomenon. Now, I'm not saying like the political people are bad or anything. Obviously, you need the guys to work out what socialism means and what Marx was saying in 1880 and, why capitalism is bad and what's going to happen and all the guys that do the YouTube stuff. It's all important, but it's radically incomplete. What you need substantively is middle management marketing people, right? As it says in the book. So they were the people that organised the phone banks because that's their day job, right? So another example of this is with XR. So XR, we're a little group, we're a bit nerdy, I've got some background in getting things done, but a lot of people haven't. And then there was this sudden insurge. And the people who are most useful were the people that organise festivals. Because if you think about it, like occupations are basically festivals. So they get the kit, they get the speakers, they do the logistics, they've got the social skills to deal with lots of people coming and going. They can cope with the stress. They basically organised it. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have been able to occupy London for 10 days. In other words, what we're looking at here is a plurality of people coming in which have all these skills. In Brixton, in so much as it's going to be successful, it's because Brixton is full of self-employed creatives that know they have to get up in the morning, they know they've got the social skills to get on with people, and they know how to basically run an operation or run a show. And they're the people that are going to pursue it. All right, so let's return then, just before we finish, to the grand strategy here. What I said at the beginning of this video is the essential thing we need at the present time is a holistic strategy, not only because we need to know what we're doing in order to take control of the state and take control of society in that sort of general sense. We also need to mobilise all those nurses and middle management marketing people and festival people, because they're not going to turn out to just do some little thing. They are going to turn out for the main show, and we need to show them how this main show works. So how is this going to scale up? That's the next thing. Okay, how does the end game work? So the end game basically means a revolution, system change, if you don't like the word revolution, systemic transformation, global transformation, all these sort of warm general words you get in the NGO documents, right? We need profound change. It's okay, what does that look like? So I think the three big moves here are, first of all, this move from a bourgeois sort of neoliberal capitalistic notion of the political party, this realisation that the political party form, which consolidated as capitalism came into its own in the early 19th century, basically belongs to the capitalist era. If we're going to move beyond that capitalist era, and we have to for all the reasons we all know, we can't carry with us this liberal form of the political party. The liberal form of the political party has two key elements, as we've discussed, right? Which is they decide the programme and they decide the candidates. And as such, they have an exploitative, alienating relationship to the population or the community. In other words, they're separate from the social space. They make the programme and the candidates, and then they go into the social space in this transactional or aggressive way of trying to get people to support them so they can do stuff. So you can see how it's got a meta-capitalistic sort of feel about it. And it's not just a feel, it is. As a standard model, it is transactional. Now, of course, there's a long tail, right? There's amazing politicians in history who've been men of the people, women of the people, all this sort of stuff, and But the point I'm making, though, is structurally it's fucked, right? Because at the present time, 50, 70, 90% of the populations in Western countries, in democracies, are profoundly alienated from this political formation. And it's not difficult to realise why that is. It's because people are more educated than they used to be. They can see the bullshit. They're not getting, carried along by all the warm words, all these liberal politicians, and they know it's not working. And they resent the idea of people telling them it is working, or they need to work harder, when they know the rich are running off with money because the rich have escaped democratic control because of globalisation, right? And what that leads then is to the search for an alternative political form, and the biggest political form on offer at the moment, which is the alternative, is of course the fascistic model, where you have one guy, whether it's Trump or Farage, who basically runs the show, and that has massive downsides because if the guy dies or disappears, then obviously you've got a problem. But the massive plus side is you just don't have all that like bureaucracy, and the guy can run off and decide what he wants to do, and you have all the advantages, strategic advantages of dictatorship, which for the record doesn't mean I'm supporting dictatorship, but we need to understand the enemy that we're facing, right, and why they are successful. It's about this providing this fantasy and providing an organisational form where people don't need to think, fear of freedom, all this sort of stuff if you read the literature. All right, so the point here is we have to move beyond this party political form in order to combat the fascistic like move. The fascistic move is to move out of the political form. We need to move out of that political form as well. What does that political form look like? Well, to a certain extent, it means returning to the ambience and social constructions before 1830. In other words, the political club. So instead of the Green Party being the Green Party, it's the Green Association. The Green Association is in Lambeth or wherever, North New York. And what do? They do the same as what they do in Bolivia, right? You have the association and they seek to influence the community, but the community is sovereign and the community chooses the candidate and the programme themselves, right? And obviously this needs some structuring. Obviously it can be corrupt and all the rest of it. But there's a fundamental change. And the fundamental change here is you're giving power back to people. And that stops them from going fascist because they can see a credible avenue to concrete power, i.e. putting constraints upon capitalism and all the rest of it and transforming it. All right. So the second point is about rupture. The point here is the example what happened earlier this year when your party was established. Jeremy Corbyn, Zora Sultana made those statements. Within 4 weeks, there was 800,000 people, who are interested, joined the party. There needs to be like a strategic awareness that these ruptures are going to happen. I mean, this was an unusual rupture because the main person on the left, Jeremy Corbyn, basically decided to create a new party. But the whole space was not prepared for 800,000 sign-ups. I don't want to go into all the ins and outs of why that wasn't the case. What I want to make clear, though, is that the issue here is ruptures will happen, and radical social change usually happens not through this grinding away of building up the social space, although that's essential. The other side of the equation is there's a rupture. And the rupture is usually external. It's an economic crisis, increasingly it's climate crises, it's a political crisis, or most likely it's an economic crisis that comes out of a climate crisis that creates a political crisis, okay? Well, no one really knows what these looks like. I talked to this economist guy, writing for The Economist, and he was going like, people don't really understand the 1930s, and it's sort of true. But the point is we have to start understanding what the 1930s looked like and the period before 1989, because now it's coming back, right? History happens, it hasn't stopped. There will be moments when you go to, the cash in the wall and no cash comes out. There will be moments when the rice runs out in the supermarkets. This is just called history. Human nature hasn't changed. We haven't transformed into some new species. We're still crap at doing social organisation. Elites still commit suicide. They're still psychotic. They always was, they always will be, right? Nothing changes in this respect. Maybe there's a case for at some point there's going to be a communist utopia, who knows? But practically speaking, this shit's coming down the line. And when this rupture happens, you have the choice to go towards a pro-social situation because there's a whole group of organisations in your borough, in your ward, in giving you pathways to mutual aid, to actually looking after migrants rather than getting rid of them and all this sort of stuff. Or you're going to have the fascistic sort of space going, come to the big rally, hear the Hitler figure, go and hate the immigrants, and we know from history what that leads to. This is like the kernel of the political strategy that this video is about. And all the work, all the smart people are doing around the Western world is about this problem, right? So we don't need to take over the state. What we need to do is to be in a position to take over the state when the rupture comes, which is a different situation. And what that requires is a centralisation of the space so that you can make strategic decisions. And centralisation requires trust, which is what requires leaders to lead from the front, to rotate, to be ethical and all the things we've talked about. Okay, so the last main sort of challenge is what I call organic growth. So usually what happens, we have this very linear, atomized, reductive way about how social change works. We go, well, we're going to start in Brixton, and we're going to build up a big organisation in Britain, and then once we're all organised, then we'll go and talk to the French and the Germans, or the Germans go, we're going to set up this thing, and then we'll go to the Swiss. That's not how the world is nowadays, as I'm sure you know, right? Basically, when a big thing happens in Brixton, there's going to be 1,000 people in Paris reading about it, going, let's do that in Paris. So this is what happened like with XR, in a rather chaotic way, is the thing in April 2019 happened, and within 3 months, XR had spread, whether we liked it or not, to 70 countries around the world. In other words, like what organic growth means is when those 10 people, if there's 10 people watching this from Paris, should be in touch, come to the Zoom call, the 10 people in Paris go, okay, so Roger and gang, did this in Brixton, Fred and gang did this in Bristol. Here's the 20-page document, here's the videos, here's the briefing, here's the training course. 2 months later, you're ready to start this in France. We don't have a strategy of going, we're not going to do France, until 2028. We're going, when France is ready, France does it. Or if it's starting in Germany, once Germany is ready, then once the Polish get interested in what the Germans are doing, then the Polish start. They don't wait. So this is the way in which, although you think I'm probably mad saying this is how you're going to change the world in 6 months. Because if it doesn't change in 6 months, it won't ever change. This is what's called rupture, being prepared for the rupture, organic growth, having modules, so you don't just go, hey, there you are, French or Germans, just get on with it. You're going, no, there's like this middle way. You haven't got like some left centralism of, Lenin has to decide when you're going to leaflet in New York or something stupid like that. Nor have you got horizontalism where it's just chaotic and everything gets taken over by, weird, over-entitled middle-class people, right? This is how you do it, right? You go to the course, you get mentoring, you have a brand, you have to do things, but the bucket is broad. You're not over-determining what happens within the space. Okay, so those are like these 3 big, political, cultural changes that need to happen within, once these Brixton type things, Lambeth things start happening. Which brings us on to the Endgame. Now, people like endlessly tell me, Roger, how do you take power? It's like taking power is reasonably straightforward once you have these resources. The reason it's really straightforward is because it's happened like 2,000 times in history, right? So, there's ways of doing it well and there's ways of not doing it well. But what you can't dispute is that it happens all over the place. So the broad bottom line here is a pincer movement. There's obviously variations on the theme and outliers, but the broad scenario, to optimize the potentiality of a pro-social revolution, what you need is a pincer movement between the outsider space and the insider space. So what this concretely means is the outsider space is the trade unions, the street movement, the cooperatives, the social organisations, and the insider is, citizens' assemblies organised by the political space, people getting voted into parliament, your communist MPs in, 1918, all this sort of thing. And then those two things synergise so that the state can't wallop the street movement because it's restrained by the people in the insider space, which incidentally also includes people in the army, the civil service, but the political class. And then the people on the inside can't be walloped because if they try to get rid of all the, communist deputies, as it were, then you get the street movement and the general strike. Now, none of this is guaranteed, of course. What we're talking about here is optimization of probability of success, okay? So you can see how this is building through the sort of Lambeth strategy, as you might say, is you're getting the councillors in the chamber and you've got the parallel assembly and you've got the local associations and you've got the general culture of cooperation, and that's feeding into the trade union space, and it's feeding into the civil service space. So that's broadly like how it happens. I'm not going to go into 101 different variations of what happens. You can read some history. History is full of this stuff. The key point here is we come out of a period of neoliberal defeatism, what I call left defeatism, where people go, oh, the bad guys are so bad, and therefore we can't do anything, and therefore we shouldn't do anything, and related themes. All of that is redundant. All of that is now like part of the enemy, as you might say. This is the biggest problem, is left defeatism. What we need to start doing is having this exuberant leadership dynamic where we say we're going to fucking do it anyway because it's going to be fun. And if we don't do it, we're all going to die sooner or later because fascism's on the way. In other words, like the whole thing needs to be turned around. Instead of thinking of structures as oppressive, stopping us from doing something, capitalism's too powerful, the state's too powerful, the police is too powerful. What we're saying is we're going to overcome them. How are we going to overcome them? By doing this strategy. Is it going to work? Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't matter. We're going to do it anyway because we're going to get hurt anyway because of what's coming down the line. You see how that works out. Okay, but there is like a little thing, I don't want to spend loads of time on it because I've spent far too much time talking already, but this is for another video or something that's going to get developed over the next 2 or 3 years, hopefully, is what the new constitution looks like, right? Because just to be clear, this is what the revolution means. To repeat, it's about constitutional change. It's not about the decisions, it's about the way you make the decisions. It's not about how the rules are enacted, it's about changing the rules. And this refers to constitutions. Now, I've talked to a few people and said, Roger, no one's interested in constitutions. And my response to that is, they will be, right? In the 19th century, there were mass movements about constitutions. People died for constitutions. Why? Because they were politically mature enough to understand who decides is the main political question, right, in humanity. Who decides? In other words, what the constitution is. So the broad direction of travel is assembly-based government. This is the revolution in the 21st century. And you can see everything's building up to this with, Green Party independent cooperation, creating assemblies at a local level. So you're building up some knowledge, a little bit like the Labour movement did at the turn of the 20th century. They'd already been in trade unions, they'd already done organisation in their communities, so when they were ready to take over the state, they were ready to take over the state because they knew how to organise things. So it's the same with this movement in the 21st century. There has to be, all these people in community organisations that already basically know how to run stuff. The nutshell of it is it's run by a sortition-based assembly at the core of it. In other words, you don't have voting anymore. You don't have people getting corrupted by being part of political parties all around the UK or any other Western country. You basically select people, 1,000 people, on the basis of their class, their gender, their background, and you put them into the assembly, you train them properly, and then they have sub-assemblies to look at housing, look at agriculture, look at climate crisis adaptation, all these different areas, and they feed back in. And then you have sortition assemblies to deal with crises, to deal with implementation, to deal with process. So you have a complex of them. So you're retaining the liberal form of having a separation of powers, right? So you're not going to some Leninist central committee tells everyone to do, or some single assembly which can get things wrong. There's checks and balances in the system. But the fundamental paradigmic shift is that you've got ordinary people running the show because they are ordinary people and they are running the show, right? There's no pretense. It's not like these guys, middle-class lecturers from Manchester running the show. No disrespect to middle-class lecturers in Manchester. It's like, yeah, you've had your 200 years of middle-class domination of the political space. It's now time for the working class, the marginalised, the migrants, all these groups who are subject to all these warm words actually getting power. And this is the revolutionary nature of sortition. It's the completing of the democratic revolution that started in the 18th century that we never had because we got perverted into voting systems, which incidentally, if you don't know, were always associated with aristocracy, oligarchy dynamics. In other words, they always led to small numbers of people running the show, which, as you may have noticed, is what happens with voting electoral systems. Okay, so that's the plan. That's the plan. It goes international. You know, read some history. I haven't got any more to say about it. So if you've been dedicated enough to get this far in the video, you'll probably have noticed this is very much a technical video. I'm not being that rhetorical. I'm trying to get to the nuts and bolts of how you actually design this stuff. That's why it's long, because I'm just trying to get it all out, and I'm not expecting loads of people to watch it. I'm expecting people to watch it who are going to actually go and do the job. And as I've said at the beginning of the video, getting on and doing the job and doing this design work, only a certain number of people do that in any historical period. That's not because I'm putting down the masses or anything. It's just that they've got more interesting things to do, arguably, okay? The important thing to sort of say here is I haven't talked much about people's personal motivation, how people do this work. But I do mean to mention at the end, if only just to sort of highlight it as something that needs to be attended to. But in a lot of the other work I'm doing, I attend to this situation a lot more, which is this issue around instrumentalism, which is, what do I need to do to get things done? And as it's hopefully been amply sort of obvious in this video, you have to be instrumentalist. You need to be focusing on what happens when we do this, what the ratio is. This is essential work in terms of transforming the system, but it's radically incomplete. And the reason it's radically incomplete is because it has a sort of heroin-esque influence upon the human psyche, in the sense that you get addicted to it and you forget why you're doing it. And this is one of the main reasons people are burning out. I've said and written about this in other places. Suffice to say, I think that it's important, if you've got to this point in the video, that you remind yourself, and I hope it's only a matter of reminding yourself, that you're doing this work as an end in itself. You're doing it because you believe in the good. You believe the good is an end in itself and such like. In other words, you remind yourself of the virtue ethics orientation, which is one word for this situation, and you need a balance between the two. Now, I just want to finish on the work of Ian McGilchrist, and he wrote this book, The Matter with Things, 1,500 pages. Don't suggest you read it all, though it is sort of cool. So if he's listening to this, he'll probably be a bit annoyed. I'm not annoyed, but basically I take his work in an interesting direction, because his work is very much saying, it's quite philosophical, it's quite spiritual, and it's making this general case, I suppose, that the point of life is to live that life and to enjoy it and to see things as an end in themselves, as opposed to this modernist, instrumentalist, reductionist, materialist sort of complex. And he talks about the right brain and the left brain and various sort of things. The upshot of it is, and what I think is interesting, is he's obviously very much sitting on the shoulders of a whole load of amazing giants, because this orientation goes back a long way philosophically, obviously, and religiously as well. But what's interesting is a methodology that he identifies. And the methodology is as follows. Before you enter into the world, you need to have your metaphysical ducks in a row, your spiritual ducks in a row. In other words, you need to be aware of the whole of the world, in an intuitive sense. Like, I'm part of this cosmos, I'm here on this planet for just a few years, you know, everything's interactive, everything's a process, all this sort of stuff. So I'm looking at the whole picture, and through looking at the whole picture, then I decide where to apply the tools of my instrumentalist intelligence. So I'm looking at the whole picture here, and we all are, and we've identified that modern civilization is about to destroy itself. We need to be aware of that, because otherwise we might just become petty instrumentalists, you know, just doing a little project here. No, we need to have that big picture. Then we go into the world, this is the second part of the methodology, and we apply that instrumentalism. We do the work. We get up, we arrive on time, we do the door knocking, we get the ratios, we work out how to improve the ratios, we go and do it again. All this work we've been talking about. And then the third part is the return to the whole. In other words, if we engage in instrumentalism It's very easy to get stuck into it and get stuck into this power orientation that we're trying to beat the opposition, and we're getting that power and the ego and the attachment and aren't we great and all the rest of it. So we need to remove ourselves from that like reductionism and go, no, I'm Roger Hallam, I'm not going to be here in 30 years' time. We're little spasms of concentrations of consciousness in the infinite void, all this sort of stuff, through meditation, through religion, through thinking about it, through reading books, whatever your methodology is. And that enables us to be gracious so that when the next generation comes along, or people from the community that can do our jobs, then we can give that up because it's not about us, right? And obviously this can happen in, a short time period. Traditionally, you go and do your work in the week and you reflect on a Sunday, for instance, in the Christian tradition. You have do your meditation in the morning, and hopefully you get through the day without being too much of an idiot. So the point here is, I'm reminding you, no doubt most of you always watching this already know this, but this is important. This is institutionalized, as far as I can see. That what McGilchrist is saying is there's a massive amount of wisdom behind all of this. And as we all know, the modernist capitalist space is catastrophically stuck in the instrumentalist orientation. And it's easy to think we're just going to replicate that because we're talking about ratios. But we're not, because we've got it culturally embedded that we extract ourselves. And after making this video, I'm going to cycle home and I'm just going to think to myself, if no one watches it, that's fine. If you see what I'm trying to say. It's like, it's fine. You do your best, as my mum used to say. That's the orientation. So I'm just giving you that reminder before we finish. I haven't got anything more useful to say, to be honest. I've spoken enough. I'm very, very much hoping you're going to come to the Zoom calls, particularly if you're in other countries, particularly if you're in London, wherever you are, come to the Zoom calls, because this is about a process. This is not an academic thing. And the last thing I've got to say is good luck. I wish you all the best, and I hope to meet some of you. Thank you.